It's basically the same thing that like the robber barons did in the U.S. with the domestic market. You know that you that's what dumping is. That you flood the market with products that are sold at a loss to get rid of your competition, and then you start selling at a profit once you have a monopoly.
Companies still do that today.
Oh yeah. Well, there's more
Disney Plus.
There's more regulations, but they figure out how to get around it, and also they'll bundle it with other things. So like Microsoft did it, like with the Xbox 360, and I think they even do it with the Xbox One too. Is that the system itself they sell at a loss? It's the subscriptions and the games that they make more money off of.
Well, and also because if you want to blame the Chinese, I get that, but you can blame American companies.
Oh yeah, no, yeah.
They want to do incremental upgrades because they want to maximize profits.
Yeah.
Whereas the technology is already there.
Yeah.
So what the Chinese do is they give you the technology without having you wait for the incremental upgrade, and they just give you the top of what we have today.
Yep.
No, that's actually not true. They still do the incremental upgrade because that's one of the ways that they're able to maximize their profits, but also limit their losses in the short term. Because dumping can be very expensive, and that if you're giving the
I'm not saying that they don't dump, but I'm just saying that they all offer you these huge upgrades in their technology. Where it's like the Apple, the last three iterations, not that much of an upgrade. If you look at the Huawei upgrades, dude, they're giving you some crazy new features every single time.
Yeah.
For me, I'm always on the stance that Android, Huawei, Samsung, whatever, always has the better hardware. But iOS, especially for your iPhone, I think it's miles better.
Like actually, the laptops are kind of a case in point example. So like the laptop I have, if you look at what kind of specs you can get in a Mac for that, they're basically entry level specs almost. That is very like it'd be a relatively basic laptop for the same price. Whereas mine has like it's like the second ranked graphics card and like very close to the top end CPU. Whereas but the only thing I'll say is that the Windows is fine. I like Windows, but some of the third party software like the Gigabyte software leaves a bit to be desired, whereas Apple, like even though their $4,000 laptop is still less powerful than that one, that it's easier to use.
Aesthetics.
Yeah.
You guys ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
All right, 3, 2, 1. Welcome everybody to another podcast of the Wisdom Factory Literary Society. We have a special episode because this is the first time that we've ever partnered up with another organization's podcast show. And we have the host of another podcast show right here, Cleveland, and he's going to tell you a little bit about what he does and sort of what the projects that he's working on right now.
Hi guys, so my name is Cleveland. I am the host with the San Most, host of the San Most Show. My show is one part current events and one part kind of interview. I have a different guest on every week. We talk about their interests or different areas. And I always try to tie that to either what's happening, in the news or local events around here, and try to get their takes and perspectives. So you're always going to get, with every episode, a different person with different points of view on the issues of that week, hopefully. And of course, you'll also get a nice little helping of some of my hot takes on issues and stuff. Some of it is better than others, but ultimately it's a lot of fun. We do like to feature local musicians on the show as well and play their music. So if any of you guys have any musical passions you want to share, make sure to hit us up on Twitter at SanMo Show on Twitter. And you can DM us. Our DMs are open if you want to submit anything or reach out. I'd be happy to talk with you.
Yeah, so we're going to provide you links. Hopefully you can get those to me. We can put those in the comment section or in the notes section. Yeah, so people can get on that because that sounds really, really cool. It's a wide variety of stuff.
We're available. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and YouTube as well. If you guys want to check us out there, if you want to search us there.
What's one of your favorite episodes that you've done so far?
One of my favorite episodes was probably with one of the people I lived in Tower Hall with last year, my friend Paul Peralta. He is in a band, a two-person band called 70 Flat, and he's really passionate about his music and stuff. I think one of the reasons it was probably one of my favorite episodes was probably for the last 15 minutes, because we came back from the musical break where we featured his new song, and he really wanted to do like an ASMR session thing. Yeah. Never done it before, but so we put on our headphones, turned the mics way up, and we started... we grabbed any of the objects we could find and started like turning the pages of a book and stuff. It was half the time I'm just holding back my laughs because we're just trying to take it so seriously, but we keep looking at
And
each
dude,
other.
that's the thing that really sets apart good media a lot of times is the ability to make people laugh and to be lighthearted and casual. Because the thing is, like, sometimes when you take something too seriously, it gets dry, you know, and that it's important to have emotion. It's important to have that willingness to talk about things. And sidetracks are not always bad. I mean, we want to stay somewhat focused, you know, like we don't want to, you know, if we're talking about, you know, courage, we don't want to be going off about, you know, how the dinosaurs went extinct, you know, that kind of thing. But at the same time, you know, it's important that it's conversational, because at the end of the day, when you're making these kind of things, it's about the viewers, you know, it's about the viewers, and that you want to deliver a product that the viewers are going to enjoy watching.
And I think that's actually what makes podcasts so great, is you can afford to go off on those tangents. You're not on like a live time slot. You can go for as long as you really need to if you want to. Actually, Dr. Jordan Peterson had a really interesting comment on that.
Quite the controversial figure.
Yes, I know. Yeah, he was on Joe Rogan's podcast, and he was talking about how, in a lot of ways, podcasting has revolutionized dialogue in a lot of ways. Because you have just these hours of conversation where you can hear the inflection, you know, the change of mood, the sarcasm in the voice. And it's completely pausable, replayable, rewindable.
Well, because it's kind of like a backlash to a phenomenon that I've noticed within our society, which is sound bites. So with sound bites, you know, because video is something that is used for a lot of different things besides podcasts, obviously. And what I've noticed, like when you have figures in the media or in politics who people want you to think a certain thing about, whether it be Alex Jones, whether it be Vladimir Putin, you know, like there's certain figures that they're consistently vilified. Like, you know, the Republicans did this to Obama, the Democrats are doing this to Trump. They're consistently vilified. And that when they vilify them, one of the ways that they do that is they use sound bites, and they try to get things that they've said out of context to make them look bad. And what that does is it makes it very difficult to have a nuanced conversation about an important and difficult topic, because you're limited just to these sound bites and that everything's manipulated. Whereas with a podcast, it gives you that freedom to be honest. And like, you know, with Joe Rogan, one podcast I watched, you know, especially recently a lot, because I mean, you know, everyone talks about, I'm like, okay, I'm going to see what this is, you know, it's Joe Rogan. And what I like about Joe Rogan's style, and what I like about the style of people who do sort of similar things to him, is that they really take time to get to know people. Like Joe Rogan has had some controversial figures on his podcast. He's had Bob Lazar, he's had Alex Jones. And while I still think Alex Jones is crazy, you know, in a lot of ways, maybe not in everything, but in a lot of ways, that I don't think he's as crazy as I did before necessarily, because when you give someone time to explain their views, to get to know them, you challenge some of their views, you have that back and forth, you get to understand some of the nuances that you might not when, because think about it, if you have a little soundbite of somebody saying, I don't like them putting chemicals in the water that turn the freaking frogs gay, you know, it's something that it's difficult to take that seriously.
You got those remixes on YouTube.
Or like the indie song, it's like, I'm like angry. You know, whereas when you bring the context back into the situation, because that's what I think I'm focusing on here, is context. That sound bites and some of these short blurbs that are taken from people to vilify them are out of context. Whereas when you listen to them in context, even if you still disagree with the message, as I often do with Alex Jones, that it makes a little bit more sense, and it's easier to have an objective and unbiased assessment of what that person actually believes, and whether or not there's any kind of argument there that maybe is worth listening to and considering.
So what I see that they do is, the context is great, you know, and that's why I love watching it, because I love hearing why someone believes what they believe, and then when they say something controversial, their full argument that supports that view. What I like what Joe Rogan does, and when I watch a Joe Rogan episode, I'll skip to 30 or 45 minutes in, because that's when it starts getting really good.
Yes.
And he does so because when you start, you have your preparation, you got the things that you need to say, plug, you know, things like that. And but he sort of gradually gets into an area where the person opens up. You know? And they become, like, in a romantic sense, authentic. And I think people recognize that. When people see someone as being authentic, it's just naturally they gravitate towards it. They find it fascinating. And, you know, it's almost like when you talk to your professor. If you're in the class having a conversation with your professor, you can have a good conversation, but it's a little dry. But when you go into their office, you know, and they're able to sort of drop their guard, or drop that facade of, I have tenure or whatever, you can have some different conversations, and their true interests pop out.
Oh, I've experienced it, because I've made friends with some professors in my time here, and it's definitely true, you know, especially like, because, you know, I'm a political science major, so I go to a political science professor's office, you know, we'll have similar interests, and we'll talk about stuff, we'll talk about foreign policy, we'll talk about law, we'll share observations about different things, and you're right, like you learn, I feel like a lot of times, the most educational conversations I've had have been those one-on-one kind of scenarios. Like, yeah, classroom is great, but there's a limit to how much you can learn when you're just trying to sit down and memorize what is said in a book or something.
Well, I hope we can accomplish that here for this episode, for this podcast, where we can get to that level where, you know, no one is nervous and everyone is able to say what they really want to say, because that's what I want to hear from you guys, because today we're talking about justice.
Yes.
We're talking about humility, and we're talking about courage. But
So it's almost like 3 topics in one, basically.
Yeah. So we're hitting you guys,
But they're all interrelated.
They're I don't know if they're interrelated, but we can hit segues because these are all virtues, and virtues are all.
And that's why I'm saying they're interrelated,
they have to
because
balance each other
one
out.
of the things that we've been talking about.
Well, real quick, Preston, let me do an introduction here. So, you know, just because we talked about who are these videos for, and you're you know, when you had this video where it was like a media thing. You know? People that like media are gonna love that, right?
Yeah.
So, what are these videos for? Who is the Wisdom Factory trying to reach out to? If you're watching this right now, if you're one of these, you're probably gonna find this interesting, because these are the people who we target. We target those who have big dreams, those who want to accomplish things in life, that want to go above and beyond. And so they're searching around for the right guidance, or the right tools, or the right principles, or the right knowledge to how to do that. This is what we do. This is what me and Preston try to do, is to help you guys along that way and to push you in the right direction. If you're just a learner, you're just somebody out there that likes to learn things, you're definitely going to get some valuable information here and in every other podcast that we do. If you're just someone who likes to have action, you're a doer, you don't really think about things too much, you just like to be decisive and get things done, this is for you as well, because we'll teach you how to be more effective in that way. And those of you that are just trying to find meaning in life, you know, I think that's what Jordan Peterson does really well, is he helps people do that, and that is a great thing. And if we can help one person find some meaning in their life, I think we've done a massive service to this world and to ourselves. And the last thing, which is my personal favorite, if you're out there and you're on team good, you know, good versus evil, if you're on team good, you're my guy or you're my girl, and together we're going to change this world. And those are the people that we're trying to reach. The first thing that we're going to talk about today is justice. And Preston, well, the Wisdom Factory we value original thought. We want people to think about things from themselves. Yes, we like to be informed about the wisdom of the past, the great thinkers that have been around, Plato, Thomas Aquinas, and all this. But I think we're going to demonstrate here what we mean by original thought. And Preston has a definition of justice we're going to preview today.
Yeah, so this is one of those things, it was a thought process that lasted a very long time coming up with this, because justice is one of those things that's really hard to pin down, you know, because it's kind of a broad concept that manifests in a lot of different ways. And like, you even in, because for my political science class, we read Plato's Republic, and that there's a lot of times where a definition of justice is proposed, and it's easy to shoot it down, you know, where like you can think of one circumstance that, you know, where that wouldn't see, that the outcome, if you follow that logic, wouldn't seem just. And that the more I've thought about it, you know, because I've come closer and closer to this definition, because my definition of justice is this, that justice is a way of ordering the world or a person's behavior. It's sort of broad in terms of the scope, it's flexible, but it has 3 components. First of all, rights need to be bound together with their accompanying responsibilities. Second component is wisdom, and then the third component is equality / reciprocity, because that kind of goes in there a little bit too. And the reason why I say this is because, you know, when you're talking about justice, you know, just action versus unjust action, that the way all the things that we're talking about have to do with how we treat others and how a system treats people. You know, what are the moral impacts of different courses of action? So I'm going to give just a brief overview of each of those. So rights and responsibilities. So when we're dealing with actions as moral agents, that you have everything that we do is part of rights and responsibility. Rights sort of refer to the actions that we take. You know, we're taking certain liberties. Like if I speak my mind on a political issue, if I use a certain piece of industrial technology, if I own a certain type of weapon, that's a right. But a responsibility is basically skin in the game. Like that's when somebody has to bear the consequences for the exercise of that. Basically, when I'm saying that rights and responsibilities need to go together, it has to do with the fact that unjust systems are those that allow one to operate independently. So, for example, rights without responsibility. If we allowed people, to have all these freedoms and liberties, but you could just sort of do whatever you wanted. You could go around robbing people. You could go around killing people. You could do whatever. That's not justice, because you're not holding people to answer for the consequences, because we have moral responsibilities to one another, and that those responsibilities are to respect things like life and liberty and property, and that when you look at injustice throughout history, a lot of times, or actually I'd say every time that I've thought of, it can be brought down at least in some way to a lack of a connection between rights and responsibilities. So you think about segregation, for example, right? With segregation, that was an example of a government imposing responsibilities without imposing rights, because the government was saying that black people are still part of this political system, but it wasn't giving them the ability to influence that political system to be part of the decision making. So it was responsibility without rights. We get to demand things from you. We get to say that if you break this law, that you get punished accordingly, but you don't have the right to participate. You don't have the right to actually be part of that system. Wisdom so that's the second component. And the reason why I say wisdom is because even though rights and responsibilities go hand in hand, it doesn't mean that everybody should have the same rights and same responsibilities necessarily. So you think about like somebody who is in government, for a president or a governor or something like that. Not everybody is qualified to do that. That you might have certain instances where, okay, so the right to wield power over a person's life and the responsibility to protect that person and to act for their well-being are definitely things that should go together. But not everybody can be trusted with that union of rights and responsibilities. Some people just don't have the qualifications and the judgment to make those kind of decisions. Wisdom is that process of allocating that. It's like, okay, who should do what, which rights and which responsibilities should be something that exists within society, should we trust people to own guns? Should we trust people to, vote? Should we trust government with unchecked power? All these different philosophical questions that we have, wisdom needs to be used to determine where that goes. The last one is and it's just kind of two, is equality and reciprocity. And I put these together because even though it's mostly equality, reciprocity can play into it a little bit. But equality is just the idea that justice is the same for everybody. That if two people commit the exact same crime, in the exact same circumstances, it's unjust to punish one more heavily than the other. So you have two identical cases, right? Kind of going back to like the segregation example. You have two identical cases. One person was white, one person is black, but they both murdered somebody in like exactly the same way. To give the black person more prison time is unjust because it's arbitrary. You're just saying like, well, this person because their skin color, or it could be anything else, political ideology, religion, that's unjust because based on an arbitrary thing that has nothing to do with the action, you're saying that somebody should have more or less punishment. Whereas a just system would see those two things the same. The just system would say, no, has nothing to do with who this person is. It's about what they did, and that the exact same crime should have the exact same punishment, and that to warrant a different punishment, there needs to be a different crime. And then with reciprocity, that goes a little bit into that as well, because when we're talking about equality, when we're really, and that sort of ties into all these things, but it's something I kind of thought of a little bit recently along the same lines as equality. But that reciprocity is this idea, like when you do something, that what happens to you is proportional. Kind of like an eye for an eye. And that goes in line with equality, because that's something that should exist for everyone. That the punishment should fit the crime. It should do so in all instances. So between those two things, every moral question that I've thought of, whether it be gun ownership, whether it be the criminal justice system, whether it be imperialism, that I've been able to articulate it to myself or to others along those lines, and I hope to do so in this podcast. Maybe we get in some of the specific examples, but that's my definition of justice. Rights and responsibility go together. That's one part. Wisdom, you have to have wisdom, and then equality and or reciprocity. I say equality is a primary thing, but reciprocity I throw in there as well. That is something that applies to everybody. You're not having arbitrary application, and that the justice looks the same for every member of society.
Quick question on that. When it comes to the interplay between the equality and the wisdom aspect, and you talked about equal punishment for equal crimes and stuff like that.
Yeah.
How does this interplay with what you've seen lately with a lot of police brutality in the nation? situation?
So the reason, there's kind of two ways to answer this question actually, because I think there's a theoretical and a practical level that you're getting at here. So for the theoretical level, that the wisdom and equality, the way I reconcile those things is just because there's differences in circumstances sometimes. So like the thought experiment I sort of did, between like the white person and the black person assumes that the exact same crime is committed. In a lot of cases, that's not the case. That you might have an instance where one person murdered somebody and it was premeditated, whereas another person did it in a crime of passion, and that those circumstances can influence the case. That being said, I think police brutality is a perfect example of inequality. And if we're talking about injustice within our own system, I think that's a good example of that, because when with police brutality, that there's a lot, like you can compare a lot of videos side by side and footage of how they've handled white suspects versus how they've handled black suspects, and that there's a lot of instances where you'll have a black suspect who is behaving in a way that is very cooperative, they're behaving in a way that's very non-violent, and yet the police officers still try to justify violent action by saying like, oh, well, this person was resisting or whatever. Meanwhile, that doesn't happen quite as frequently with white individuals, and in some very extreme cases, you might even have instances where a white individual was very combative and they still got preferential treatment. A perfect example is like with the El Paso shooting. There was a picture they took of the guy outside. I think if anybody deserved to have the cops just beat the crap out of him, it was probably somebody who did an heinous crime like that. But no, he was standing there and they had him handcuffed, but they were talking to him like just kind of normal. Whereas in the meantime, you had people who have been black who've been shot just for doing nothing. Now, I'm not saying that either of these cases are necessarily representative of how all black people or how all white people are treated. There's obviously outliers. There have been white victims of police brutality, and there have been black people who've been treated fine by the police. But that being said, I think when you look at the disparity, that the fact that there oftentimes seems to be different standards that are used by the police officers, I think that violates that principle of equality, that in our country, the way justice is applied doesn't impact white and black people as equally as it should.
So the thing that bugs me with that problem is who's doing it. It's the police officers. Those are the ones that are supposed to enforce justice. That's on their badge. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Protect and to serve. These are the people. They're the magistrates of the community. They're supposed to be the ones enforcing the laws, aka upholding the justice. And when they're the ones that are committing the injustices, it's a double whammy.
And not to mention the special rights and privileges and technology and weapons they're granted to help better enforce justice. But in a lot of ways, it becomes almost abusive
against justice, and that is a dangerous, because that can collapse society.
It can.
If enough people in power, because it goes to what Preston was saying earlier about how the ruler has to be competent. The ruler has to be able to dispense justice, and sometimes they can't. And to me, that's a red flag. When you have officers that can't uphold justice, they give them too many chances.
Well, and they get paid
leave.
So that they get paid leave, or they get a slap on the wrist. And I get it, because their superiors are sort of the same mindset that they were. So that's a huge problem. And I think that's what bugs me about it, is you have the people that are enforcing the justice and they're committing the injustice. And it's definitely an equality thing. It's definitely an equality thing, because the ideal scenario is that but you know what? I do believe in police discretion sometimes. Like sometimes I have friends that they've been stopped, they've been pulled over, and they were just in a bad time. Like they were moving from one state to another. They didn't have their tags, they didn't have any insurance, and they didn't have they were poor at the time. They weren't in school. They were depressed, and so the cop was understood. And the cop was like, you know what? I'm not going to give this guy a ticket right now. I'm going to let him go. And I like police to have some discretion. So, I don't always want, treat people equally. What does that actually mean? Because in some cases, if you do that, is he going to give everyone a pass? So I would like them to have some sort of discretion, but that goes into the competence, that goes into the wisdom. And that's why I think justice is deeper. Justice does go deep, though. The more you look at it, the more you reason it. And I like your definition, because that's a good working definition that we can operate from. But real quick, when it comes to justice, we have to answer the question, the glaring question: where does it come from? Does it exist? And I think the first stab that we can take at it is, did you guys, I guess I'll start off with Cleveland, do you guys see justice existing in the animal kingdom outside of humans? Is there justice in the animal world, or in the, with any other species outside of humans?
When it comes, I guess, to the animal, I'm thinking more along the lines of ecosystems. There are certain boundaries where if you cross that line with, like, if you have a predator that, is either unchecked by, certain factors of the ecosystem, whether that's externally affected or if they just grow uncontrollably by some random chance. I mean, you can overhunt a certain land or certain species. You can put entirely, you put a species entirely extinct, or you can overgrow your population, and then suddenly there's not enough food to go around. Eventually, there is some kind of punishment. I'm not sure if we call that justice, but there is a reciprocal nature, I guess, to this overtaking of resources and things like that. But it also kind of comes down to the question of, are they consciously knowing that they're like, oh yeah, we are definitely eating too many zebras or whatever it be, because at a certain point they're hardwired to just see prey, get prey, no matter the cost for most cases. I mean, you see, but that's also an interesting thing with, I guess I'm just using lions for the example, I guess, today. But, with smaller cats, they'll chase laser pointers because it's like they'll think it's a small rodent or whatever it is. But for like big lions and stuff like that, tigers, they don't chase those because that's not worth their energy.
Some guys actually tried that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they took a laser. Yeah.
Like, how bored you got to be to go out there?
Yeah.
Maybe it was like a science experiment.
Yeah. Well, yeah, no, it's scientific because they're kind of, these lions and tigers, these big cats are pre-wired to basically say, like, it would cost me too much energy. Basically, the energy expanded versus the energy returned from consuming that little like speck on the ground. It's not worth it. So they're just hardwired to not chase that.
So you have a big laser, they might chase it.
Yeah, if you get, or like even like a fake rodent you're dragging across the ground or something like that, they'll probably chase it. I mean, it's something bigger, but it's kind of an interesting thing. So in a lot of ways, I think the natural balance of things has hardwired a lot of these animals to be able to have these self-sustaining systems outside of, I guess, conscious decision. Because I think justice comes because I think justice exists and it makes it uniquely human in a lot of ways, because humans have that sense of decision making and free will. And there are consequences for actions and such, because part of the reason there's consequences and part of the reason insanity pleas and stuff like that typically work is if they weren't consciously aware of the decisions they were making.
So consciousness is like a prerequisite to,
because I mean you have to decide that, hey,
to act justly.
I'm going to do this, and by accepting that, hey, I'm going to do this, you're accepting the consequences of that action, whether those are good or bad.
So there's and this has been brought up. I saw this on YouTube. So monkeys have this thing where they have the natural hierarchy. Right? So you have the big guy at the top, the big I think this is so chimpanzees, and you got the alpha chimpanzee. And if he's like unruly, if he acts like a tyrant, he just is self-interested, he doesn't care about anybody else, he's mean, he doesn't form relationships with people, the other monkeys will gang up and take him down when he's most vulnerable. And when he does act, I would say justly, or at least what looks like just, they they love him and they make his life more better, they honor him, he's able to get more friends, he has more women, and he doesn't have to worry, he's more of a happy person. And so you could look at that and say, well, it seems like the monkeys are operating off of something that is just. Now, are they conscious? I would say there's a level of consciousness there, or at least a level of they understand cause. They understand what I really think it is.
They understand cause and effect.
They understand cause and effect. And this is what also I think they have emotions. And this is scary because I'm not committing to this, but I'm going to throw this out there, that it's possible that justice is simply a reflection of empathy and jealousy.
They could be. I mean, to kind of add to your point with the primates thing, now that I think about it, in my social psychology class, they're kind of talking about the reciprocity piece, and they've done experiments where they have two little chimps perform the exact same action, and one gets like a bunch of grapes, and the other one gets like a little, I forget what it is, but basically it's proportional rewards for the two different things. And one was given like a cucumber, and the other one was given a bunch of grapes when they performed the identical task, and they saw each other perform the identical task, and one get rewarded unequally. And eventually they got fed up with like the experimenters that kept handing, they swatted the cucumber out of his hand. They're like, no.
Well, see, so that's why I said what I said. That justice could simply be empathy and jealousy, because what you have there is the one who's not getting as much as the other person, they're jealous. And all the other monkeys who would be watching this would feel empathetic about that guy not getting his due. And so it's possible that that's all justice could really be. And I don't believe in that.
There's a lot of problems with that I could call just like right now.
Yeah, but it's an emotional thing because you get.
Well, I do think emotion's part of it. That I think the only issue that I would say though is that I do think justice is more than about emotion, because emotion is just passion, and that passion can lead us to do some pretty extreme things. That if you're just envious or whatever, that just because you do something out of envy or empathy or whatever it might be doesn't mean that it's necessarily just. Justice I think sometimes requires us to curb our emotions and to recognize that maybe we may feel a certain way, though I may have anger or happiness or sadness, it doesn't necessarily mean that I should just do what I feel like. But when it comes to justice in the animal kingdom, so I think this is actually like a lot of different questions in one, because you're dealing with things like, which species are you talking about? You're dealing with things like, how things were even created. Is there a God, or is it just kind of like an anarchic type of system? But I'll try to break it down as something more simple. And I think what I would put it as is this. There's a difference between asking, does justice exist versus is it followed? And that applies not only to the animal kingdom, but also to the humankind. Because think about it. With humankind, I think most of us are in agreement that at least when it comes to humanity, justice exists. And that's how I feel, Jordan, that's how you feel in Cleveland. I'm sure you feel that way. But we've obviously had regimes that were unjust. You had Nazi Germany, you have still communist China. Earlier we talked about the Jim Crow South. There have been regimes that don't follow justice, and even those that are just by and large, might have unjust components. So I think we need to separate those questions. And the reason why I say this, because that's the basis for my answer with the animal kingdom. I said justice does exist in the animal kingdom, but similar to how with humanity, it's not always followed, because with the animal kingdom, you're still, like you were talking about.
What's the situation that it is followed? That's what I'm trying to.
So yeah, a situation where it is followed, I think, would be kind of similar to. Actually, no, you already gave the chimp example. There's another one that I wanted to talk about, and one actually is with dolphins. So with dolphins, that similar to chimpanzees and monkeys and stuff, they have complex social orders, and that they understand the relationships between different ones, but they also, there have been instances of dolphins rescuing people who have gotten stuck out at sea, doing things, recognizing that someone was in distress, and that, that there was life in danger, even if it wasn't necessarily their own life or the life of somebody in their pod, and acting based off of that. So that there seems to be a sense, among dolphins in that instance, of a right and wrong thing to do, of a just and unjust way. Similar to if I see someone who's, they're drowning, it would be just for me to try to do something about that, call a lifeguard, or, if I'm a strong enough swimmer, go out and maybe try to save him myself, like that kind of thing. Or it'd be unjust for me to just be like, whatever, that they're dying, survival of the fittest, that kind of thing. And that the dolphins have shown that same kind of capacity. So I definitely think that justice does exist. And another reason for that, and this is where you get into a little bit of theology, because part of the thing for me is that I'm a believer in God, that God is the source of everything, and that God is, love and light and justice and all those good things. And that when he ordered the universe, that God did that in a very deliberate way, but because he gave us free will, and because he gave we could debate about whether animals have free will. I think that's another, discussion that could be had. But the point is that, if the source has justice, then it's out there, and it's out there to be discovered, because God created, he created man in his image, and God created everything else that there is, and that everything has a divine purpose in God's plan. So, that if you believe in God, that justice would definitely exist even outside of any kind of social construct with humans or animals. And it's just a matter of discovering that and having that come to Jesus moment where you're able to recognize justice and follow it, as opposed to just living how your emotions tell you that you should live.
And if I could make a comment on that briefly, because you mentioned the dolphins too, but we're also talking about chimps. It seems like there seems to be the closer you get to higher level processing, like on the level of a human, there seems to be more of just complex social structures, but also a sense of justice, because chimps and dolphins are definitely two of the smarter animals of the animal kingdom. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if there's a correlation between.
I would absolutely say so, and that's actually another point I had kind of forgotten to make, is that because with my definition of justice, I talk about wisdom, and that prerequisite to wisdom is sufficient intelligence. That justice is a complicated principle because it requires us to consider dilemmas. It requires, like with justice, when you're dealing with various trade-offs that could be made in moral decisions, it's not always easy. One example going back to Plato, and Socrates, of returning weapons to a friend who has asked you to hold them, but that friend maybe has some issues with their mental health. Where you might have on one hand the obligation to be honest and tell the truth, but on the other hand the obligation, to protect your friend, and you're recognizing they're not well. So justice requires reason, in the sense that questions of justice are very rarely straightforward in the real world, and that you have to be able to think about the relationships between different moral agents and how those play out in order to come to an understanding of justice. And that organisms that don't have that capability of complex thought, are not really able to engage consciously in that process of like, this is justice, this is not.
So I want to bring this a little bit to Plato. So now we've sort of talked about our conceptions of justice, and Plato believes that it's a higher principle, right? So justice is something that he says, don't trust your senses. And this is from the Republic. Don't trust your senses, because it's like the allegory of the cave, where you're only seeing a reflection. Your life is an illusion, and if you're going off of empirical data, your justice will shift always. Whereas if you understand that there's a true principle out there, sort of like, it coincides with like Christian theology, which I'm a Christian as well, and I believe in there is a eternal justice, a true justice. So you sort of can weigh any given situation where that, okay, there's a principle that's permanent, that's cemented. And it's your job to use rationality to figure that out. You can use the data, the circumstances, and the evidence and all those things, but there is a higher principle there. And why I bring that up is to tie that into what you said about, animal kingdoms, and that it seems to be a higher level of evolutional, emergence, right? So where you have high social orders and high cognitive capacity and high intelligence. And what I've heard is that when a human being is operating on, high principles, it's a different part of the brain than when they're operating on pure selfish motives. And that's the more reptilian side of your brain. That's the more primal part of your brain. When you're operating on these high principles, these high ideals, sort of like a Platonic sense of justice, it uses the more developed part of your brain.
Yeah.
And so I think that you would see animals, as they start to evolve in that direction and have access to that part of their brains, that they should be able to access or to uncover, to be able to discern, perceive what justice really is.
Yeah.
But so real quick, guys, now that we sort of have a good baseline about what justice is, and we do have some evidence that it exists, there's some semblance of it in the animal kingdoms, and that if justice is true and universal, and if it does bring order, like you said, Preston. Real quick, what does a world look like where justice doesn't exist? Let's go the opposite direction.
So with this one, I mean, when we're talking about a world where justice does not exist, there's a few different characteristics you can look at, and as I did before, I'm going to start with rights and responsibility. So I'm going to borrow a little bit from the founding fathers here. So when the founders of the United States were talking about how to create this country, there were two things that they were concerned about: tyranny of the government, but also licentiousness of the people. And those respectively correspond to responsibility without rights and rights without responsibility. That when you have a situation where people can sort of just do whatever they want and there's no consequences, and that there's no, like not even consequences from other people, because obviously you can have justice theoretically without government if other people, like if the community acts against you, But if you have a scenario where people are sort of just doing, like I said, is there somebody who they can go around and murder and there's no consequences, that's injustice. Whereas on the flip side, injustice could also be tyranny, responsibility without rights. That there's, so that's like slavery. That's like where things are being demanded from people. They're being required to do things, but they don't have agency in the decision making. That their rights are not being respected. That they're not being, seen as full human beings. And when you're talking about a world where there's no justice, both of those things would be prevalent. Tyrannical regimes, such as totalitarian dictatorships, or just pure anarchy, where it's just the strong survive and there's no semblance of order or community. That is what injustice is. And when you go to places like Somalia and North Korea and communist China, you're going to see a lot more injustice than you might in other parts of the world, because those things are not ordered together. And then similar things could be said with the other components of justice that I had talked about. That in an unjust world, one of the ways that an unjust world is created is through poor decision making. Because one of the reasons why I used the founders as an example is because kind of go in line with that wisdom component and also with that equality component. They're thinking about what sort of systems are conducive to justice, what sort of systems are going to make sure that rights and responsibilities are ordered in such a way that they're bound together, and that people have freedom, but that they're also held responsible for their actions. And then if the government is going to limit that freedom, they also have to limit that responsibility. And that in an unjust world, there's not really going to be a lot of consideration given in terms of deciding like who has power and who gets to make the decisions. It would best be maybe picked at random, or maybe a survival of the fittest. That it wouldn't be something that people think about, and that power will be kind of handed out willy-nilly or in accordance with just a total lack of any kind of structure or social norms.
I'll just make it quick. So to me, you have injustice, you have massive suffering. That's pretty much what it boils down to. When you have justice, you have people that feel a sense of fairness, and you have people that they can pursue their happiness without having to worry about that chaos. But Cleveland, is there anything you wanted to say when it comes to a world without justice? I think you painted a perfect picture of where injustice does exist. But I think America overall does a good job trying to be as just as you could be, as you could, might want to be. That's my personal opinion, but what do you think is paint a picture for us of what injustice looks like if it just runs rampant? If people woke up one day and said, hey, there's no evidence that justice exists, it doesn't exist, let's overthrow it, everyone do what they want.
No justice.
I think in a lot of ways, I do agree with you that I think America is a uniquely special country because of it's less founded on like European countries, like an ethnic identity or cultural identity that was kind of already there before the modern government kind of took place. America has founded on ideals. Right. Do we always live up to those ideals? No. And I'd argue that for most of our history we have not. Right. But the fact that we can still strive towards something to live up to is what makes us uniquely special in a lot of those ways. And I do agree with Preston in a lot of senses that when you lose accountability, you lose justice. I think those are incredibly integral. I don't think this is a necessarily societal thing. There's a fantastic book called Tribe, and they talk about how they had a lot of certain ways of doing justice in a lot of these Native American tribes. And it really helps to explain a lot of the social problems we've been having as a country since the emergence of like the 21st century. One thing he talks about is how if a certain member took too much from the collective resources of that tribe, they were outcast. They weren't killed. They were just permanently removed from the tribe, and they were basically shunned. Yeah. And in a lot of ways, he compares this to the 2008 financial crash, where you had Wall Street and you had a lot of these big corporations in the housing bubble where they knowingly inflated it further and further and further at their own expense and their own gain. And then he says we missed our opportunity to enact justice there because they should have been punished to the fullest extent for their actions because they consciously, knowingly chose to overinflate this housing bubble, basically without, and basically without fear of any consequence. And then once everything came crashing down, we lost so much industry. People lost their homes, lost their careers. Some people are still unemployed from that, almost over a decade later. And what do these Wall Street executives get? They get a golden parachute. They get to basically retire early. We bailed out all these banks with taxpayer dollars. So basically, the people who suffered the worst brunt of these basically inequalities had to end up also further paying to fix them.
Well, that goes into a wrinkle that I wanted to add in there about justice and the conception of justice, because it necessitates the person who dispenses justice must have power.
Yes.
There's an element of you have to have the power because to be the one that is even making the judgment about what is just.
Yeah.
In Christianity, it's God, right? He's the one that on the day of the judgment, he makes all the decisions over everybody.
Yeah.
Right? And he's got
who goes to heaven, who goes to hell, who goes to purgatory.
Exactly. And so in our society, our leaders, they're the ones you're saying, well, that's not just. They're still the ones that are deciding what is just. So what I would say for practical purposes, anybody out there who has a better conception of what justice could be should pursue positions of power, because that is how you make the world a more just place, is you have more just people getting into positions of power where they can use that power to form a more order and harmonious.
Yeah, because that's I actually was talking about this a little bit earlier with Nick, who's also part of the Wisdom Factory. That the thing is that when it comes to whether you believe in justice or not, the way the world is ordered in sort of a natural sense is a realist type of order. You know, in the sense that for anything to be binding, that there needs to be some sort of power. And now, given power can take different forms. You know, sometimes there's soft power. That sometimes maybe it's the ability to gain the sympathy of another person or to persuade rather than to hold a gun to someone's head. But at the end of the day, it's still power. It's still that ability to make a decision and to control how resources are allocated. And that every successful revolution, whether peaceful or violent, has in some way been able to usurp power. Every failed revolution, whether peaceful or violent, has failed to get power and has been crushed by those in power.
And it doesn't even have to be, you don't have to be the president. I'm not advocating out there everyone, run for the 2024 election. But, your CEO, your boardroom executives, or your management,
your mayor,
or your mayor, or your county commissioner. In the business world, there's positions of power. In the household, there's positions of power. The world is based on hierarchies, whether we like to admit it or not. And the person at the top of those hierarchies, that's who needs to be just. And so that's why, like I said in the beginning, the Wisdom Factory is for ambitious people. And that's something that we have to recognize.
And I feel like part of the problem is sometimes people view justice as in opposition to hierarchy or in opposition, to maybe certain obligations and stuff like that. But I don't see it that way. I think justice is just about how we order that. It's about how we order the hierarchy. That hierarchy is inevitably going to be part of it, as are other things, that our need to survive, our need, if we're talking maybe at a collective level to protect our corporate or national interests, are going to be part of that. Justice is more of a principle that we follow, that when we're thinking about how to pursue those interests and that what the goals should look like, option A, option B, which one should I choose? That justice is that principle that we can follow. Say, this hierarchy is good, whereas this other hierarchy is bad.
Okay, so I'm glad you bring that up, Preston, because it's one thing to say, hey, everyone, be just, right?
Yeah.
But when you really get down to it, having to be the judge or having to be the manager of a company when there's a dilemma and you have to decide, okay, what am I going to do? What is the right thing to do here? What best calculates all the interests in a way that is fair? It's a really difficult thing. And so I have a scenario for you guys, okay? This is a fake scenario,
all right.
Okay? So you take it too far. But the first scenario, okay? Cleveland, what would be your sense of a just outcome if Preston stole $2 from you while you weren't looking?
$2. Just $2.
Just $2.
Check my wallet real quick. I've just been getting shooken down the entire podcast slowly. Like, you guys are just pulling my phone out or whatever.
It's the perfect cover of the Justice
exactly.
podcast.
From my own personal perspective, it would ultimately, I would like Preston to probably answer for his actions, because I think a lot of, especially crimes of theft are typically, unless you're a kleptomaniac, are probably crimes of desperation. I think when you see a lot of folks who steal from grocery markets and stuff, usually it's because they can't really afford to pay for that kind of stuff. So, it would depend on the context around Preston's actions. Yeah, but if you like...
What if his motive is just because there is no moral motive? He's just being an asshole. He just wants $2 because he wants to go get something in a vending machine.
Well, I think that digs at deeper psychological issues.
That's the question that I'm asking.
Yeah. So if you want me to go a more literal route with it, I think it would have to probably do something deeper psychologically. That he may have been wronged in the past per se. That maybe I don't know, if he was bullied as a kid or something, and he's adopted the worldview that the strong can take what they want, because as a kid he was bullied, and these kids who were either physically or in some way more powerful than him abused their power, and so he in some way found that like, oh, this must be the right thing to do, and nobody's gonna be able to stop me. Or maybe I think you see it with a lot of cases too. Some people who seek out power positions, they didn't have a lot of power either in their youth or early adulthood, and now they want to, in a lot of ways, make up for that
So are you
later
saying that
on.
he shouldn't be punished because he had a hard life?
No, not necessarily at all. But I'm saying I think there needs to be, I think, deeper digging into the motives. I mean, if it was me and my $2, Preston and I we're friends. You know, like if you really need those $2, go ahead. I'm not going to start a war
Well,
over $2.
He didn't need them. He didn't need it. So, what you would be like magnanimous and say, you know what, keep it.
I
There's
don't.
no right or wrong answer.
Yeah, I think, because I mean that depends. Because I'm trying to think in the nature of hypotheticals that applying that further on. I think there's certain points to where you're gonna have to draw lines, but ultimately it's going to come down to arbitration some way. I'd probably ask.
So if I may
somebody else.
interject,
Yeah.
one thing I was going to talk about is how I think this is one of those moments where we get to talk about something I actually really want to talk about, and that is that there's the line between and the difference between justice and mercy. Because at least in my opinion, and some people may disagree, I think mercy, though it is a virtue, is something that's distinct and different from justice. Because mercy is when you're doing less than like you could do, right? So essentially mercy in some ways kind of requires unjust action in a sense, because you might be saying that, well, this person owes me this, but I'm going to be merciful and virtuous and choose not to take what I'm owed. Yeah. And I think that's what that is. So what Cleveland's saying, because I want to just kind of answer this question too, because I think it's a good one, is that what Cleveland's saying I think is a good example of like the merciful thing to do. That if you're, because here's what my idea of justice would be, is that my idea of justice would be, because
Well, Preston, the question I was going to ask next was, so you're the one that stole the $2. Mm-hmm. What is your conception of justice? So you stole his $2, but you were caught.
So are you talking about like from the perspective of me when I'm stealing?
From the perspective of the person who did the wrong thing.
What would drive you to steal?
Yeah, well, I want to answer both parts because I think they're important. But I kind of had, because there's an observation I wanted to make. I'd say for me that it would just depend, because obviously, it's not consensual. Like consensual, if the money's taken consensually, that's fine. Whereas for me, my idea of justice would be to either establish that consent or have some sort of reparation. So what I would want if I had money taken from me would be, no, I'm going to answer that in a sec. What I would want if I had money taken from me would be something like either they give me my money back, or if there is a circumstance, they take the time to explain that. That if I'm going to be merciful, I should be given a reason. Now, to answer your question, because I know you kind of planned this out, I want to make sure it's answered. I want to make sure it's answered.
We were going to get to the mercy.
But what I was going to say is that so if I were to put myself in those shoes, that the way that I would be thinking is plain and simple, might makes right. That if I'm saying that, in terms of, and the reason, like I understand the whole desperation thing, right? But just because you're desperate doesn't necessarily mean that the action's just. Just because I don't have, a backpack doesn't mean it's okay for me to just go around taking people's backpacks necessarily. Whereas, so what I would be thinking in that scenario is that in terms of how I solve my problems, not so much what the problem is, but how I go about solving them, that it's okay for me to go and do whatever I feel like I can, and that if I can get away with it is good, if I can't get away with it is bad.
So your conception of justice in this situation, as the person who stole the $2, is I should get off scot-free.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. That's Preston. There's no right or wrong answer.
You steal $2 from me anytime.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. Now, given that's not how I would actually, approach this. Like, I don't think stealing money is right, but
there's two more scenarios. There's two more scenarios.
But like, if I had to put myself in the shoes of a thief, definitely.
There's two more scenarios we got to get through.
Yeah.
I thought these were going to be quick answers, but
dude, this is Wisdom Factory. It's not going to be quick.
There's a third perspective. Now, there's my perspective, right? I'm the person that watches this happen. And I guess I should have mentioned this, but we live in a world where it's just us three, right? This is just, there is no government. So I'm the arbitrator because I'm the one that wasn't affected. I'm the best that can handle this because, you caught Preston and you said, hey, you stole my $2. I have you here. Jordan, what are we going to do? I want this. Preston's like, I want this. Okay. Mm-hmm. So there is a sense where I have to look at it from, I don't want to be as merciful as you because this could happen to me. And if I'm as merciful as you, then it might happen again, especially if he's like, well, I don't want anything to happen to me anyway. You're giving him what he wants.
Yeah.
There's no incentive for our little society to be improved, because this is my take here. So I would have to, so as the person who's not affected, and in society, there's the two people there's the wronged, and then there's the person who did the wrong, and then there's everyone else who's not affected. And I think those are the three perspectives that are most important.
Yeah.
And so my perspective would be a little bit harsh. I would just say, Preston, you would have to give him $3. That's what it would.
I mean,
down
and that's kind of why I'd ultimately push for arbitration of some kind.
Yeah,
Because I mean,
exactly,
I
'cause
think
you
$2 doesn't mean a
understand.
lot to me, but if it comes down to something more personal
Well,
to me,
that's
I
the
would.
second scenario.
Yeah.
What if he stole $100 from you?
Well, that's different. But I mean, because at a certain point, then that would be cutting into.
That's different.
Well, I mean, with
Wait a
$100
minute.
bucks, I mean, I am a college student here. I mean, $2 is not much, but it's
What's
2 to
what's
100.
justice to you? He just stole 100.
Well, I mean, I'd probably want that money back, if not more. But I mean, with the $100 too, I think the reasoning I would say that's a different scenario is suddenly you're cutting into my, the budgeting I have set up for the year. You're cutting into, I mean, assuming that we still go to college in this 3-person society and stuff. But I mean, it comes down to suddenly you're affecting my life. You're affecting my way of life, whether I can buy groceries for that week, stuff like that. So suddenly you're altering both like my choices. You're removing choices basically from me with that money. $2 doesn't affect the amount of choices I can make, but $100, something that makes it entirely different.
Like that could affect your ability to pay the rent,
Yeah,
for
and that could
example.
get me
You know,
evicted.
like if your rent is $900 and you had saved $900 for that, and then now you only have $800, you might not have a place to live next month.
That could do
So
real harm.
Your sentence, like your request, I want this sentence. This sentence is based off what you're measuring justice to be. This is the Justice Podcast. So you're putting in all these calculations, trying to be as just as you can. What is the sentence that you want to see for this?
Well, I mean, let's see here. I mean, because I'm trying to think of our strict little 3-person society existence here.
This is you.
Okay.
This is you're as the
Yeah.
person who it happened to.
Well, I mean, for me, I think I definitely want the money back.
$1,000 or $100.
Yeah, $100. And then beyond that, I mean, it depends on Preston's motives. If Preston was just like, I don't like you, I just wanted to really just hurt you, then that'd be different versus like, I really need it in that way or something like that.
He has no moral justification for this.
Yeah.
action.
Then, I mean, in those ways, I think it sounds, I guess, harsh, but I mean, I probably want double back what you stole from me.
That's
At a certain point, especially if your only intent is just to harm me, I'd rather like, all right, fine, I get back what's mine, and then I'm basically going to return the favor to you.
Person.
Yeah.
What's the sentence that you think should happen to you, given off of you stole his $100, and he's telling you, hey man, this was hard for me, but you don't want to. Maybe you do want to pay $1,000. But what do you think you should do? Like, how do you think you should be able, like, your conception of justice in this situation?
Yeah.
And you can't sort of say, well, justice doesn't exist, because like if it's like, well, I should be off scot-free. Like if you had a conception of justice, you did something wrong, but what do you still think?
Okay, so I think with my answer before, I think maybe that had a little bit to do with how you were framing the question, because my idea is that if I'm trying to put myself in the shoe of a criminal, I mean, yeah, obviously, if I'm doing that, I would want to get off scot-free, but if we're talking about the idea of justice, so, thinking about, rather than putting yourself in the shoes of someone who does that and rationalizing it, maybe I guess, just like if I chose to do that right now with the values I have, I mean, for me, I guess it would be, I would say, give the money back, that it would be one of those things where, but it would be kind of, actually, it'd be kind of circumstantial. I think that if he had enough money where it wasn't affected, he'd give money back. But here's actually what I was thinking, is that maybe it could be something where, not only give the money back, but that I guess like I would have to, if he was like in a desperate situation, like if he was living paycheck to paycheck, like I would have to help him with his rent or something like that. That basically impose a similar burden on me to what was imposed on him. Now, here's my reasoning for that. So kind of comparing the scenario, right? That with the $2, that because the burden's so low, I think just getting the money back would be enough. $2 doesn't affect anything. But like we were talking about earlier, that when it's $100, there's an additional risk on top of that. So just giving the money back would be unjust, because I've imposed on you losing the money, but then also the problems of not being able to pay, for certain necessities. Whereas what I'm giving you back is just the money. So it would make sense that I have to pay a little bit of extra or maybe help you with rent or groceries. That way I would go through that suffering of, how am I going to be able to pay the rent? How am I going to be able to pay my groceries? And that would send a stronger message. And that basically what I'm going through, and having to suffer those consequences would be about the same as what I put you through by stealing that money.
I think that sense of justice is kind of almost like, if we want to think of a societal aspect, it's almost state-enforced empathy in a lot of ways. The same way you discipline kids. It's like, sometimes, especially when you're little, you just don't have a sense of how your actions affect others. You're like, and you make them understand, this is what it feels like to have this happen to you.
Yeah.
And then suddenly you might have that sense of regret, like, oh, I had no idea to make them feel that way.
That's why my reaction, and I think this is the second time this has happened, but my reaction as the outside observer is I want Preston to spend a day in jail, because I think this was bad. This was, to me, $2 was scot-free. You guys should work that out. $100 is a little bit where I kind of want some hardcore consequences. I don't want I give you the money back and we hang out on a Saturday and I help you take out your trash to help you. To me, that just doesn't seem like it enforces the law. So that's interesting that in two scenarios, the arbiter is the one who is enforcing a harder penalty. But the last one that I have is, okay, so now we're going to take it to the maximum. You had $10,000 and he got into your bank account. He stole all of it. This is the final scenario. And like this has really just truly destroyed you in your life or whatever. Like $10,000 would destroy me right now.
Yeah.
Like I would be set back months.
Yeah, no, me too. Yeah.
So now what do you, well, you know what? Let Preston be let Preston be the one.
I get back at Preston by hacking his bank account.
So there we go.
Preston is the one who's in the moral right here, okay? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So Preston, he stole $10,000 from you. Mm-hmm. So what do you think is the sentence that should be administered?
So I say that's the point where I would bring jail time into this, and a lot longer than one. I want him to spend, maybe like a couple weeks in jail, maybe even more depending on the circumstance. Because I feel like, with $2, it's not that big of a deal. With $100, it's going to have some impact, but by sort of forcing the person to pay more than they took, you could deal with that. But I think with $10,000, you're dealing with secondary and tertiary impacts coming from that could be so large that, it's not just about the money anymore. It's not just about the money anymore. This is about my ability to plan for my future. This is about my ability to pay for my college. This is about my ability to put gas in my car. If I have kids, it's about my ability to take care of my kids. And those are things, money's money. If I was Bill Gates and someone stole $10,000 from me, that'd be like the $2 scenario. I'm like, okay, I don't like losing money, but it's not that big of a deal. But for normal people like ourselves who are not filthy rich, $10,000, that'd be a huge amount of money for me. I'd be set back months too. I just don't have that kind of money. And if someone hacked into my account and made it where I had to pay, I lost that, I wouldn't be able to make it. And so that's definitely one of those things where it's like, I think somebody deserves to lose their freedom for a period of time, because of that. Or, the only way that I would consider something besides jail is if it was something like of equal magnitude, like, community service hours are one thing that's done, there's other options, but I think I used the jail example because I think that's kind of a good idea of the magnitude of punishment that I would want, that something serious would have to happen to them. I don't want it to ruin their life completely, but they need to do some hard time and show it's not okay to go up and take $10,000 from somebody.
Yeah. Do you accept, are you going to do 2 weeks or would you ask the judge for something different?
I mean, well, if I'm trying to get out of this, I'd probably pull out.
See, you're in the same dilemma I was, because I'm trying, on one hand, I'm trying to be realistic, but on the other hand, I was like, well, if I'm stealing, I want to have a less punishment.
It's interesting because it seems to me that if that's the natural tendency, that the person who does the wrong is in no position to say what justice is.
Yeah, well, both have.
I'm trying to give them a chance here, but it seems like it's a natural thing.
Well, because I think it has to do with bias. That what happens is that, because you have to factor in emotion, that when you're the victim, you're angry, and you have a tendency to want to demand more than is owed to you, whereas when you are the perpetrator, even if you recognize there's injustice, you want to kind of get off, a little bit easier, and that goes to what you're talking about, the need for an arbitrator, that having an objective perspective a lot of times is necessary to deal with the emotional variables.
So getting off free is off the table, because you're in court. The judge is asking you, hey, what do you want to happen to you? If you say, nothing. He's gonna be like, no. Let's go with Preston's idea.
Yeah, and
Give me something that you can justify on a just level that you think should happen to you, which probably should be a little bit less than what Preston is offering.
I mean, if I can briefly comment kind of on the idea of always wanting to go out free, I think in a lot of ways, getting out free is also freedom of consequence. And I think once you've already accepted, in this case, theft, you kind of, you accept the consequence, but you also don't want to face it, because you also don't want to face the pain that could cause Preston. You block that out of your mind. You're more focused on your pleasure or your want for that $10,000. So you want to face as little consequence as possible, because you already pushed the thought of, oh, I'm hurting this person out of your mind. Yeah. So you push that way back so you don't think about it. But if it came down to sentencing, if I was trying to make a reasonable appeal, I'd probably say give back, probably what I owe Preston, what I stole from him, in half, and then probably loss of freedom for a week or so, probably somewhere along those lines. Because I mean, there's certain points to where your freedom goes. You need to have some kind of restriction on it. Obviously, you've proven that you cannot handle this kind of freedom without harming somebody, so you need to have time to think about this. And I think the reason we kind of talked about motive, especially the $2 thing, is you made the point of not putting forward punishment because of having a hard life. I think that can be misconstrued that way, but more for me, and that comes down to a whole different commentary on the justice system that we probably don't have time to get into, but I think in a lot of ways justice needs to be more correctional and less punishment. I think in a lot of, because otherwise you're just, you get these cycles of, well, they didn't learn anything really other than just to resent getting caught rather than to resent their action.
Yeah, that's why. So my take on this would be, I think I would meet y'all somewhere in the middle, and as we get more higher, I start to have more mercy, as the judge, because like you said, the crime is bigger, therefore your behavioral integrity is more tarnished. Yeah. And the more I want to bring that back in. Because if you stole $2, you're still kind of a good guy. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? You steal 100, yeah, you're a bad dude, but you're not a menace to society. Mm-hmm. You steal 10,000, you're a damn menace to society. Yeah.
That's enough to ruin anybody.
And the more I want to, the more I'm willing to make the attempt to correct your behavior so that, you're not out in 2 weeks and you're doing it again.
Yeah.
So I would say, now this is where it does get tricky here.
Yeah.
So I definitely see that you're a menace to society, but I would say a week, you pay him back, and you have to go on a tour explaining why you did what you did was wrong to other thieves. Mm-hmm. Like you would have to try to use this situation to help other people understand why it was wrong. So not only do you become corrected, but other people come corrected.
Because you need to understand why it was wrong.
Exactly.
And I think another thing too that's kind of gotten overlooked here is the role of somebody having remorse, because I think in each of these scenarios we talked about giving the money back, Right. And I think that for me, I know especially the way that laws work here in the U.S., that 2 weeks even in jail would be a relatively short period of time for someone to spend in jail for stealing that amount of money. That being said, if they're willing to give back the money, I'm fine with that. Where I think I would get a little bit more harsh with some of the sentencing is when you're dealing with somebody who they just absolutely will not give back the money. Like maybe they spent it and there's no money to recover, that kind of thing. And there's like that's where I'm like, what? We're talking months, in jail, because I think remorse is part of it. That if somebody recognizes that what they did is wrong and that they are willing to go and say, well, I'm going to make it right, and then here's a little bit extra, on top of it, then I think that's fine. If I get my money back and then somebody else suffers some consequences too, I think that's a just outcome. Whereas when you have somebody who they, till the bitter end, like kind of like with Jordan's example, like if you go up in front of the judge and say, nothing should happen to me, that's the kind of person where I want to lay down the law. I'm like, you know what, bud? You not only did you do something wrong, but you're not remorseful. You got caught red-handed and you still think this is okay to do this. You're not even able to give the money back because you spent all of it on just, booze and hookers or whatever. Guess what? 8 months in the slammer, a year in the slammer or whatever.
Actually, this kind of brings up an interesting scenario I just kind of thought up. It's like, okay, what if while you're sleeping, I took $10,000 from you, I went to Vegas, and I made like $100,000. And I gave you a huge cut of that. So I more than 5 times your wealth. I gave back. You didn't even know what happened. You never suffered anything from it. It happened overnight. And I was able to basically, I stole the money from you. I gambled it, I won, and I basically gave you 5 times more than what I took. How does, that's basically stocks. But, that's basically stock market. But I mean, in a lot of ways, if I take that from you, you're not harmed from it, you don't even know what happens, and you only experience the benefit of me doing that. Is that still wrong?
So
Is it punishable?
So that I would say it's not punishable. No, this is because here's the thing. The reason why I'd say that is because, well, and I might be a bit biased because I'm a consequentialist. Like I do believe, like I still think in that scenario, the action of going and stealing money from somebody is still not a good thing. That being said, if I got back 5 times, I mean, that's the time where I'd be able to exercise a lot of mercy and be like, you know what, man, I ended up with more money out of this, so I'm gonna let it slide. You know.
Investment.
So some of the observations that I got from this one is that we all 3 had different varying conceptions of justice. And so that's interesting because if justice is a universal principle, where is the justice, right? What I would say is that, well, an individual is, all consciousness would be justice. So not one of us is going to know. But if we sort of combine what we all thought justice was, we might better be able to get to what justice truly is.
Well, that's why I think.
So I would say real quickly. So I would say that in this society, I think it would be a good rule that the just sentence would have to be 2 of us would have to agree. Like it would have to be like I would think that the arbiter is the most preferential person. Like his opinion should weigh more. But at the same time, I think that justice has to be satisfactory to all parties involved. Like the first scenario, we were all pretty satisfied. And the second one, we were still kind of satisfied. The third one, there's a little bit more of a split. But I think that justice necessitates that we're satisfied with the outcome. And because that's when we have a natural, our sensibility sort of can see that, this was justice because it feels like justice. And there is an intuitive nature to it. So either the arbiter, because what if, so me and Preston agree, he was the person who did wrong in the first 2. But me and him agree that the sentences was okay. You disagree, it should still be okay. Or in the last scenario, or in the second scenario, whatever the one where you were the person who was doing wrong, if me and Preston agree again, because he's on the opposite side, that it's just, or the opposite, or me and you. But what about a situation where, because you guys would never agree, so it'd probably have to be the arbiter. And
that's why I think a jury of peers is so important. I think to have not only, I think, the judge serving as the arbiter, but also having randomly selected people from within our shared society to also basically debate, discuss, and to weigh the merits of certain punishments, certain options, and to weigh all the evidence and facts
and then
in
also,
the case to hand out justice in a way that they see. They basically consent to saying, yes, this is the most appropriate action to take at the betterment.
And that also ties into like the social contract theory, because in this fictional society that we've been discussing throughout these examples, where it's just the 3 of us, that if I want to be part of this group as opposed to being alone, that means that I agree to be part of the social norms. So if I'm thinking about, for example, that maybe there's certain things let's say I want to steal some money, but I know that in this space that's not something that's tolerated, that we respect property rights. For me, I'm thinking about it from the perspective of, if I join the society, it's because I'm okay with saying, I'm giving up this ability to just take whatever I feel like, because the benefits of being in this exceed that, and I know if I mess up, I agree to suffer those consequences. But you're absolutely right though about the importance, because with justice has to be based on reason. But people are not always reasonable creatures, because of emotion. That it's like I had said earlier, a lot of times the victim has a tendency to want more than is owed. The perpetrator has a tendency to want less. Not always, but it's often the case. And even sometimes the judge could have biases. Like what if the judge has an ideological bias or a racial bias or something like that, and that having multiple people involved, like that's why we have an appeals process. Even where things where it might be, like not only do you have the jury, but even with that jury and judge, you have the appeals process. The reason why is because justice needs to be able to check biases of people. It needs to be able to find the sentence that is not based on just that passion, but rather is based on an analysis of the wrong that was committed and what is reasonable and proportional in response to that.
Because here's the thing, is because as the arbiter, it's sort of like, you know, someone is getting tortured and you see someone getting tortured, or you see someone, you know, going through a tough time, like someone is sick or something like that. You feel bad for them, but you still, as a third party, have no idea what that's like. You have no idea what that experience is like. So for me, it's almost, it's not just for the arbiter to always say, this is what should happen, this is what should happen, this is what should happen. Because on a case-by-case basis, I don't know what this experience is like. And if the shoe was on the other foot and I was in y'all's position, I would probably say, oh, I was wrong all along. We shouldn't do what I said we should do. That's why I said there should be a consensus between the party that was wrong, the party that was that did the wrong, or at least their input is valuable into finding what that just thing is.
Yeah.
You know, maybe less so the guy that wants to get scot-free all the time, but you know, there is, I think there is some truth into, hey man, that's not, because like, what if I was like, okay, you stole $2 from him, that's 5 years in prison. None of you guys are satisfied with that.
No.
You know, but I'm the arbiter. So, you know, I think that there should be some consensus in this little society. Now, I think the way that you check for that in the real world and the practical application is, like you guys said, appeals processes, trial by juries.
So actually, I have a question for you though. So what about the concept of deterrence in justice? Because I think one of the reasons why we were talking about sentences of, you know, giving the money back or 2 weeks in jail, or, you know, I had talked while you were gone a little bit about like if the person just refuses to give the money back, or if they spent all of it maybe a longer period of time in jail, like months or something like that. But there's also, and this is where kind of that tough on crime philosophy comes from. What about the idea that like very harsh sentences could deter it? Because if I know that if I steal money, you know, that you got to weigh that there's always the possibility I could get away with it, right? You know, I might not, but there's that possibility. So it's sort of a risk-reward thing. So if I know that the most that I have to suffer is something that's mostly reciprocal, maybe giving the money back, spending a little bit of time in jail if it's a lot of money, and spending a lot of time in jail if it's a lot of money, and I don't give the money back, that might be a risk I'm willing to accept for the potential payoff of getting that money, and that could incentivize risk takers to go and do stuff. Whereas a sentence of 5 years or 10 years in prison, like something that's just absurdly long, that seems unjust, but that could be something that might make me think twice. So how do you respond to that argument? Do you think deterrence has a place? If so, when should it be used? And if deterrence does not have a place, what makes you say that?
I think rarely ever should that deterrence and that tough on crime policy really kind of be implemented, because it depends on what your outcomes of the justice system want to be. Do you want to punish, or do you want to limit that behavior? I think the best deterrence is having this rehabilitory nature in the part of the sentencing to make sure that they understand this action was wrong and they do not repeat this offense. Because I think the larger goal of a societal justice system is to make sure that this does not keep happening. And so I think with a lot of ways, even if you give these, you know, lifelong sentences, they learn nothing from it. And so what's the point? They're just going to rock.
Well, actually, I would now again, I'm playing devil's advocate because I agree. I'm more of a reciprocity kind of guy. But just for the sake of argument, you know, that I would say they absolutely would learn something. They would learn that there's consequences for their actions. They would learn that if they are going to violate the rights of others, society is not going to have any mercy towards them, and that's something that could get people in line. You know, like if I think about this from a perspective, if I'm a criminal who's just cutthroat and self-interested, you know, I just care about making money. I don't care if I'm throwing other people under the bus. You know, I don't care if people die because of my actions or if they can't pay their rent because of my actions. You know, that having that kind of thing, you know, where it's a very harsh sentence, you know, could really set me straight. And from that deterrence perspective, knowing that's what I face, it could tilt that risk-reward calculus in such a way where I'm like, you know what, I don't want to do that because 5 years in prison or 10 years in prison is a very large chunk of my life. I don't want to go through that.
Yeah, but what are you resenting there? Are you, because in a lot of cases, yeah, you learn something, you learn not to get caught. You resent getting caught. You don't resent the action. You don't say like, oh, I shouldn't have stolen that. You say, oh, I shouldn't have gotten caught. And so it becomes less about the actual wrong and more about the punishment.
But that's something that exists in either scenario, like whether the punishment is a lot or a little bit. And the other thing too, even if you're dealing with more of a corrective or rehabilitation-based approach, that somebody who knows what they're doing when they steal isn't necessarily going to be changed as a result of that. So it's one thing, you know, if maybe there's mental illness or desperation involved. You know, if the person's a kleptomaniac or if the person's having a hard time feeding their kids, okay, you know, maybe something that focuses more on restitution and rehabilitation can be good. But like, let's say I already have money. Like, let's say I'm I'm not a poor college student. That I'm instead, somebody who's relatively wealthy, maybe wealthier than the person I steal money from. Maybe I'm a millionaire, you're not, and I steal money from you. I feel like that's something where I'm not going to change because I kind of knew what I was doing, and that efforts to correct that are not going to be effective unless I'm taught that there's consequences to that action. That that this is not something that's acceptable within the society. You will be punished. You will be made to suffer if you do this to people.
In a perfect world, and we can't do this because it's simply there's too much people and there's too much case-by-case basis. But in a perfect world, it would depend on the crime. There are certain crimes that seem to be perpetrated by people who could be corrected, versus there's crimes like murder or like grand larceny or like high level crime where it's like these are just bad apples.
Well, that's actually one of the reasons why in murder cases they make it.
There's people that are out there that they're, no matter what you do, none of you guys is going to work because you lock them up. They don't care. They're going to be in crime. They're going to be in jail, still operating within this crime network. They can do that. They as long as they have contact with the outside world, they can still maneuver and they can be the kingpin inside that prison and still be just as bad because now they're killing people in the prison. So no matter where you put this person, they're just a menace to their environment. And you can have a Sunday program where you have a preacher come to them, and sometimes that does work. Yes, it does. But sometimes these people are they just want to watch the world burn, and no matter what type of corrective thing you're going to do, it's not going to work. But that's why you can't have a blanket statement. Human nature is different. What works for one person could be different for another. Yeah. But I would say you're more hard crimes. You're more like super treason or murder or rape or things like that. That's where I would see the hard penalties coming in. But things like where it's like a drug crime or it's like, it was a crime of passion, things where people aren't normally committing crimes, but they just so happen to cross that line, then I would say, you could have a more therapeutic option. Yeah. That's somewhere that we can meet in the middle. But we spent a lot of time on justice, guys. We still got two more to get to. Okay. So the last thing that we should talk about as the Wisdom Factory is we do want people to be more just. And so the first thing that I would ask, that I would say before I ask you guys, how does a person go about becoming more just, better? How does a person become better able to measure what is the proper thing to do in a situation where justice is required? But before that, I want to make an observation that justice, like you said, people don't get caught a lot. And a lot of people do things that they're committing acts of injustice, and there is no justice simply because no one knows they're doing it. And to me, that's the biggest problem with justice. And so no matter at what level you're operating on, like we talked about before, at the private level, in the home or in a company or in a government level or on the world stage, if no one knows that there is an injustice being committed, nothing can be done about it. So the first thing that should happen, that I would advocate for out there, is people to, try to become aware of injustices that are happening. That's the first step. As far as how to become more just, I would say that you have to be just to people that do you wrong in your life. That would be my advice. When someone does you wrong, try to take a step back and be a third party and say, well, what is the proper just way to handle this? Because a lot of times someone does us something wrong and we're morally justified to hit them on the head with a hammer. We're morally justified in doing that. But trying to say, what is the best way to handle this that leaves both of us satisfied, to where they don't have a lump on their head, but they still sort of understand that they did something wrong, and taking that passion out of it. So that's what I would say, is trying to be just to people that do you wrong, and trying not to do people wrong and commit acts of injustice. That's one way that someone could cultivate justice within their character. So, you guys?
To cultivate justice? I think in a lot of ways, we didn't really get to dig into it that much, but I'm agnostic when it comes to the question of God. And I mean, we could have a whole podcast of my falling out with the church and all that, but mainly, I think when it comes down to it, the best way to kind of cultivate justice is more compassion, more understanding. I think in a lot of ways to exercise mercy, but also to be able to have the appropriate punishment. But ultimately, I think you have a lot less situations where you have to punish if we all understood each other more, if we all cared a little bit more about each other, we showed more compassion towards one another. If we're all just a little bit better to each other, I think we would have a lot less of these tough situations where there are a lot of these crimes being committed. Of course, you're always gonna have those bad apples. You're gonna have those people who just do not care about consequence, whether it be a psychological thing or if it's how just the years have turned them that way. But ultimately, I think with just a little bit more compassion, the world can be a lot better. I think we can work to understand each other. And the reason that we do things, I mean, that's part of the appeal for psychology in me is I want to understand why people do what they do. And so, in a lot of the same ways, and that's kind of why I dig into the psychological aspect with crimes. There's usually an underlying reason why people do that. And it's cliche at this point, but say that hurt people. Usually there's something else going on that has driven them to do that. Whether it's justified or not, there's still usually a preceding action that has led them to hurt somebody else. Yeah.
So for me, it's about ordering the way that you think about moral dilemmas. Because with justice, it's, as we've discussed, it's tempting to sort of just lash out in certain ways, but kind of like how it kind of in line with what I had mentioned in the beginning with my definition of justice. At the end of the day, the reason why this matters is because we live in a society, because our actions influence the outcomes that befall other people and vice versa, and that because of the fact that our actions can influence the situation with other moral agents, we have to think about that. And that the way that I would say it is that when you're ordering your thought, you need to make sure that people's rights and what they're owed are always part of that. That when I'm thinking about an action, that am I depriving somebody of something to which they are entitled, whether that be property, whether that be life, whether that be dignity or respect? Am I depriving somebody of something to which they are entitled? Because that's what a lot of times what it boils down to. If somebody does something and it doesn't affect anybody in a negative way, even if maybe we don't disagree with the method, if nobody was harmed and it wasn't even self-harm either, because you can get into self-harm. Let's say they didn't even harm themselves. They're just doing something. Maybe they like a video game that you don't like to play. That's not something that I feel like is unjust for them to do, because no one's affected. Why would I punish somebody if it doesn't affect anybody? Whereas when you have something where other people are affected, that's when you have to think about, okay, well, how are they affected? And if they're affected in a way that deprives them of their rights, if they're affected in a way that makes them worse off than they would otherwise be, that's an unjust action. And that in terms of how we can be more just, being able to go through that thought process when you're living your life, that instead of living by your passions and living just by however you feel is going to be the most expedient for you in that moment, think about, are my actions going to contribute to more suffering or less suffering than if I were to not take those actions?
So it's interesting that you guys say that, because in both of y'all's answers, there was a sense of, in Preston's, you have to recognize the rights of other people. And in yours, it was about trying to understand them. And I love both of those. And I think that leads very well into the next topic, because in order to do both of those things, you have to have a level of humility. You have to have a level of understanding that we're all equal, because that's the next topic that we're going to get into.
That's an excellent segue.
So this is
because being unjust and being egotistical seem to go hand in hand. Like a lot of times, people who think only of themselves are the people who perpetuate the injustice we talk about. Like even Plato says it, that the tyrant, all he loves is power and pleasure and stuff like that. That he doesn't think about what other people are going through as a result of his decisions when he's governing.
So humility, right? For a baseline definition, and I mean, you guys can challenge this, but this is basically a quick one that I think anybody can grab onto, is when you don't have humility, humility is a sense that you're not more important than anyone else. So you can imagine a scenario where you do feel you're more important than everyone else. Why do they have the same rights as you? There's no way they got the same rights as you. You're more important, your rights are stronger, or you deserve a different type of treatment. You have a whole different set of situations going on with you because you have a higher value, right? And if something happens to you, all that value gets put out the window, versus something happens to them, what's the consequences really, But that's not humility. And so it's almost impossible to do what you guys were saying if you don't have that humility. The second component of it is it's not just lowering yourself, because that's where people look at humility and it's like, well, what if I am more valuable? You know, and it's not just about lowering yourself to this low pit where it's like, oh, I'm worthless just like everyone else. No,
You don't need to go all the way to the basement. You know, there's a middle ground. Be like on the ground floor of the house.
Right, but it's more along the lines of equalizing yourself so that you can respect everyone else. Just putting yourself on the same line of respect. No, you respect me and I respect you. Yeah, I'm a CEO and you're a cook, but that doesn't mean that I can't respect you because we both are humans. You got a family, I got a family, and we're both citizens of this society, and we should just have that respect. You know, I wouldn't want something to happen to you and then happen to me, vice versa. So those are those two components. It's not having this inflated ego, this inflated sense of self-importance where you're putting yourself above everyone else, and it's also extending that respect, extending that sort of mutual feeling of equality with each other. So the biggest problem right here, and this one's going to be quick because it's pretty straightforward, right? Humility is straightforward. So to me, it seems like the biggest antidote to humility is success, because anything that does sort of give you a sense that you are more valuable, you are more superior, is going to kill your humility.
Oh yeah.
And that's why I think this does tie well with injustice, because the most people that are committing the most acts of injustice, the ones that have the most impact are the ones at the top.
Yeah.
Like you brought up with the financial crisis, right?
Well, I think humility is really important in understanding the effect that power can have on people, because I think it was Thomas Jefferson who had said that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That what happens is that when the sense that you're more important than other people is definitely something that can lead to corrosive effects of power on your moral standing.
So you know, case by case, you see that happening, right? So racism, classism, any sort of tribal group conflict comes because one feels they're superior than the other. And you know, if you have humility, it's like if you have humility, you can build connections because you can recognize, oh, that person is just like me. Oh, we're all humans, or I wouldn't want this to happen to me, so I'm not going to let it happen to them.
Yeah.
And so when you have that humility, you're able to recognize the humanity in others, and that's why I think it's so important. Because without it, you're sort of, you can justify, at least in your own mind, you can rationalize, treating people differently because they are different.
I think humility and empathy go hand in hand, no doubt. In a lot of ways, I've had my own kind of journeys with humility. I grew up an only child, so that kind of, because especially when we grow up with siblings, you definitely have that recognition of other person, pretty early on. But for me, I was, especially growing up, very much the center of attention of my family, and so it was kind of hard. I was a little bit behind the curve socially, especially in my younger years, because I didn't understand that it wasn't like all around me. I was still very much in that like id state of mind, like the psychological id, ego, and super ego sense. I was very much still in that like it's about me, my immediate pleasure, and nobody else. And then slowly over time, I've come, you come to learn that other people have motives, other people have needs, other people, are just like you, and that they have, and one of the early things they talk about is with little kids, if you ever babysit or something, usually they'll walk right in front of the TV and sit down right in front of you, because they don't recognize that you're behind them trying to watch too. They're just more concerned with them seeing it, and so it's that same kind of sense of recognizing the other person. And honestly, I mean, I've had my journeys with humility. Part of actually right now my philosophy class, we're having the great God debate, and part of it is we were just going around saying how we felt about things with that. And for me, one of my huge pet peeves is on either ends of the spectrum, where you either have the Christians who like to claim absolute moral authority because only on the merit that I believe in God and I'm a Christian, therefore I lord my moral authority over you. Yeah. But on the other end, just as bad as I think you have the super snarky, hyper intellectual atheists that say like, oh, you're just a simple-minded person because you believe in God. I use facts and logic, and I have, intellectual authority over you. That kind, they're both, I think, are both equally obnoxious in that sense because of that hyper-inflated ego that they think they both have, and that lack of humility. And part of the reason I've kind of found a nice groove in that entire debate with agnosticism is it's okay for me to say I don't know, and I think it's part of the humility aspect is being able to realize and to know that you don't know. And
So
that's
what
with a lot of things.
what I would say with humility, because I like the direction you're going in, because that's sort of what I was thinking about while I was listening to both of you. That I think a big part of humility is it has a lot to do with breadth of perception and understanding, allowing that breadth of perception to expand beyond yourself and appreciating the value that other people bring to the table. Because, when you're dealing with humility, I think what arrogance and ego is a lot of times, it's not just overstating our importance, but it's overstating what we know. It's overstating how central we are to the way that things work. And that when you're, with humility, somebody who is humble understands that there is knowledge outside of their own perception, and furthermore is able to avoid limiting their perception of the world to only what they know, that they're willing to consider other perspectives in shaping their worldview. I think a lot of times arrogance and self-righteousness, will go hand in hand, because a lot of people that I've talked to, and this happens, with religions, but also with political ideologies.
Yeah, yeah.
Like I've noticed a lot of times, particularly extreme ones, like if you've ever talked to a communist or to a right-wing extremist, or a neo-Nazi or something like that, those people think they got everything figured out, everything. Like they don't want to hear any other perspective, any other argument. It's time for the revolution. It begins now. There's no changing it. And I feel like that's a problem, because as much as we might not like to admit it, human knowledge is limited. Not only is my knowledge limited and your knowledge and your lot knowledge, our knowledge as a species is limited. There are things that nobody knows that we're still trying to figure out. We have scientists working on those problems.
And I think I think in a lot of ways, college just humbles me a lot, because and by no means was I ever the smartest person in the room in high school, but it was a different kind of thing, because I think with how, especially towards your junior and senior year of high school, it was a hyper competitive. So, I'm going to this college, I'm going to this college kind of thing. And it was about like, obviously I earned this right to go to Harvard or to go to UT or MIT, whatever it is, because it's treated on such a meritocracy level. Like, obviously the best people go to this college. And I think once I've gotten to college, I've kind of come to the realization that, like, I don't know everything, and it's okay not to know everything. I'll get there. I'm not going to know, I'm never going to know everything, but I'm going to learn with time. I don't need to know everything right now. I can take things bit by bit and not have to worry about being, because I think that's, usually you get that with some folks, and even, Shakespearean characters, where they have to overexert their own perception of how smart they are to people, and they end up looking like an ass most of the time. It's like like Dogberry from Much Ado About Nothing. He uses these gigantic words that are gibberish, basically, but they sound smart, and he thinks that, if I say these big words, that means I sound smart, and then it can end up backfiring. And I think you have that too with a lot of the self-righteousness too, because you have like government officials or tyrants in these cases that think, I know better, I know what's better for our people than our people do.
Right.
And you become, this overplayed, self-elevated person, and you suddenly lose all connection with the reason you're there.
That's one of the main things, and we're gonna do this later, Preston. But we're gonna have a podcast on Julius Caesar, and in every case, you have a great character on the world stage, right? That's able to do things that no one else can do. They're able to bring in order to a society that did not exist. They just have such a high level of competence and such a high level of what does he call it? Like motivation to get things done, to be the man of action. They don't talk about
Determination.
Ambition.
Determination. And they create a world that is really, really substantially more developed than the one that they were born into. But every single time you have an ego problem. And that was Caesar's problem. At a certain level, he wanted to have these honors. He wanted people to address him in a certain way. And it really rubbed people the wrong way. And it cost him his life.
Yeah.
And if he would have just been more humble, if he would have just been more open to other people's ideas. And this is like Napoleon. This is like, most of your, even American world leaders do this. Like Theodore Roosevelt got like this at a certain point. But you see this, and it's a tragedy. It's a tragic thing when someone has that heightened inflated ego. And I would even accuse Donald Trump of having this.
I mean,
what
a bold stance.
That's the understatement of the year.
People are, and you're seeing this already happen, but he's no longer the buzz, the buzz, the sort of entertaining guy that he was. He still kind of is, but it's not like it was when he first came out. People are kind of getting tired of it. People are like, they're becoming aware of it. Like this is just not, people still want to vote for him because he has policies that they think are effective. But people get tired of that. They really do, of this overinflated sense of importance, and no matter who you are.
Nobody knows more about foreign policy than me, believe me.
Eventually, over time, people wary of it, because it sort of makes them feel like, well, what am I?
I think that's why we have term limits for those.
And also, this actually makes me think about some of the reasons why we would consider humility a virtue. Because when we're discussing these things, it's important that we nail down exactly why they're important. And there's a multitude of reasons, that sort of, as an exercise of humility, but on my part, I'm not claiming that this is the all-encompassing explanation. But that being said, I think one of the reasons why humility is a virtue, at least from a practical perspective, is that a lack of humility really limits our knowledge. Because if knowledge is good, like I believe knowledge is good both intrinsically and extrinsically. Therefore, things that allow us to pursue knowledge and use that knowledge to do good things are virtuous actions. Arrogance is something that is not virtuous because it gets in the way of that. Because when you're humble, by keeping a beginner's mind and by staying open to what other people have to bring to the table, you can increase your base of knowledge much faster, and it allows you to be more effective. Like I know a lot more than I would if I'd never listened to anybody else. Why? Because sometimes there's people who maybe they're better at a certain subject than you, or they studied it more, or heck, it could be as simple as they got to that question first. Maybe they wrote a book on it before you were born or something like that. And having that humility to take feedback from other people in social situations, to consider the opinions of experts when you're doing research, is how we're able to grow as people and how we're able to expand our knowledge. Like the example with Napoleon and with Caesar. Napoleon, especially later in his career, made some strategic blunders. And one of the reasons why was because he got so arrogant from his successes that he didn't want to listen to anybody. Hitler did the same thing in World War II, that Hitler would not listen to his generals because Hitler was on a power trip and a half, and he thought he had everything figured out and that nobody could tell him he was wrong. If they told him he was wrong, he'd send him to a concentration camp or have him killed or something. And look, it cost him the war. Whereas when you're humble, what that does is it increases your access to other people's knowledge, and you're able to adapt, you're able to adjust. And what that actually allows is that not only are you able to pursue more knowledge, but you can be more effective because that knowledge gives you a broader range of tools in your toolbox. And it's like, well, maybe I'm not right about this. However, if I'm not right, I want to learn the truth. And then once you know the truth, you can use that truth to do good things.
So it's interesting because in my life, where I'm humbled the most is like where I'm at home. So I live at a place where it's like a community home where, there's a lot of older people there, people that come from a lot of different backgrounds, and, they're sort of low class people. And how much I talk, right, at the Wisdom Factory. We're always dominating discussions, or we're always the main ones giving our input. And it's interesting because when I'm with these people, I don't talk nearly as much as I do. I listen, because those are the people where we don't expect wisdom to come from, and those are the sources of where a lot of the wisdom can come from. These people that have lived, because a lot of times as scholars or intellectuals, that can be a source of ego inflation as well. I got a degree, so I'm better than you, you're just a mechanic or something like that. But these people have life experiences that are so rich in meaning, and learning, like you as a person who want to understand human psychology and the human nature, listening to these people will give you way more insight into that than it would if you're just reading a book.
And I think it's particularly true with moral truth, because a lot of times the best advice that you will get on morality and ethics and justice will come from people who have been to the other side and had a transformation. Because we judge things in part based on their opposite. We can define light in contrast to darkness. We can define good in contrast to evil. That we see things in dichotomies, in nature and also in human interaction. And that when you've only seen one side, that can limit your understanding sometimes. Whereas what happens, like with people who have been alcoholics or big time criminals or something like that they've been, and that they see what life is like on that side, and that when they have that transformation, that transformation doesn't just come out of nowhere. That transformation comes because they see what that brings, and at some point they have a moment where they wake up and they're like, you know what, this is not the life that I want to live, and that there's a thought process that goes into that they could explain, and that when they're telling somebody, you know, about their experiences, they'd be like, no, you know, you don't want to go do this because yes, it might seem like it's pleasure, or yes, you know, in the case of crime, it might make you a lot of money, but this is the road it sends you down, and you don't want to go down that road.
Yeah, and that's exactly what it is, Preston, is because these are people that have made a life full of mistakes. Therefore, they got a life full of responses.
Lessons too.
You know, what did they learn in this scenario? Who to stay away from? What to do in this situation?
Yeah.
Practical wisdom is what it is. So another wrinkle about humility that I want to put out there is, you know, for me, what it comes down to is it sort of it gives you peace. This is one of those things where humility makes you happy. When you feel a sense of humbleness, you feel a sense of connection with other people. Whereas if you put yourself on a pedestal, it's so lonely up there. I mean, we've all been up there before, right? You know, none of us are perfect. I've had situations where, you know, I thought I was the shit or whatever. It's
Jordan, I think this is a good time to admit that you and I have both been on power trips in the Wisdom Factory. It's happened.
It's going to
Wisdom
happen.
Factory
We're ambitious people.
Yeah.
And that's okay. But here's the thing, Preston. I'm glad that you mentioned that, because that gets me to what I wanted to say, and that is when you have a humble mindset, there is no, if this person rises, I have to fall. It's you're happy and you want what's best for everyone. So you do what you can to help that person reach their potential, and you don't feel a threat from that because, you know, it's an abundance mindset. Oh, well, I'm still going to be me and I still have all my value. And none of that is tarnished by this person rising to new heights.
And if I can add to that.
Well, so let me wrap up that point. So so that's what it is. Because if you don't have humility and it's all about ego, and you're in a room and two people have a strong ego, one person's rise is the other person's fall. That's how you see it. Where if they're both humble, it's the possibility that both of them can rise together, and there is no conflict there. And that's what you see, like in Rome, when you had Pompey fighting Caesar, fighting Labienus or all of them. They all fought each other. Rome would have been such a great place if they all just...
Well, and I know Cleveland has something to say, but I just want to interject real quick because I remember we had a conversation about that if Pompey and Caesar had worked together, oh my God. You think the Roman Empire as it was impressive? Oh man, like they could have taken over the world, man, because they were the two greatest military leaders of their time. You know, that Caesar and Pompey just had this ability to conquer in a way nobody else could. But because in each of their views that they felt, you know, that the town wasn't big enough for the two of them, that they led Rome to civil war because they both wanted to be in charge, and neither of them could accept that, you know, maybe the other might bring something valuable to the table. You know, Pompey and Caesar could not look at the other one and say that, you know, well, maybe he's right about something, or maybe I should, you know, listen to him or give him some power. No, they wanted everything, and it led to a lot of destruction.
And I think kind of both feeding off what Preston said earlier and also what you're talking about there with the humility. I think when you were talking about how we can only define darkness when compared to light or good.
Well, I didn't say it's necessarily the only way, but it's like that's one of the biggest ways. Like we look at things and we contrast it to, okay, here's what something is, here's what that's not. And we can see this is what makes it different in how we know when something's here versus when something's not.
And we often do that with ourselves, both externally and internally. We wouldn't really know who we are if we were the only person in existence, because we don't have things to compare ourselves to. Like, you know, that's not saying like I'm better than you, but it's saying like I feel differently about this than you do, and that makes me different necessarily. We learn who we are based off of other people and how they are, and then in turn learn who they are in return. It's this kind of reciprocal nature of we both understand more about ourselves when we understand more about each other. And in that same sense, I think when you lose that humility, you also lose the empathy and the ability to relate to other people. And so then you lose the ability to view yourself. When you put yourself up on the pedestal and you say I'm above you, so therefore I can't compare myself to you. Then suddenly you lose the mirror into yourself.
Another
and then you
thing,
become your position.
Yeah. Another thing too, I think, is that humility is necessary to make sure that you don't get the means and the ends confused when it comes to competition. Because competition is something that can be good. You know, that like I'll get into arguments with people sometimes because one thing that I hear all the time is like, oh, well, it's not good to compare yourself to other people. And me, I compare myself to other people and I will not stop. And I think everybody should compare themselves to other people. And the reason why is because, you know, not only is there that subconscious component, but comparing ourselves to other people is a good way to get a sense of what's possible, right? So like, you know, I'm 21 years old, you know, and I come from a certain background, right? If I look and I see somebody who came from the same background, who's the same age, but they're like the CEO of a company or the director of the CIA or something like that, I'm sitting there thinking, what am I doing with my life? Because that person has proven it's possible. And I'm thinking about what is it they're doing that I'm not? The problem is, though, that competition can become bad when we lose sight of the objective of the competition. The objective of the competition is to lead to better results. Sometimes people just want to make it about winning and winning for the sake of winning. And when that happens, you know, what we do is that we get so fixated on that it actually makes it more difficult for us to accomplish our goals because we become more insecure, we become less rational because sometimes we might do something that's not in our benefit just so we could win.
And if I may really just quickly kind of go off what you're saying, but also finish kind of my thought with that. With when you put yourself on the pedestal, you lose the ability to compare yourself to other folks, and you also lose that internal knowledge in yourself. You become, so then what do you have to compare yourself to? The objective, the world of the objective, the physical world, only position, status, you know, means, and these are all finite things, and that puts you in a mindset of scarcity. When you're in that mindset of scarcity, suddenly it's an entirely different world. But when you find your self-worth and your humility in the fact that you are you, and you basically have to find your self-worth internally, that you are valuable because you are Preston, you are, you know, I am me, that's why I am valuable, versus I am a commander, that's why I'm valuable. You have to find the value internally and why you matter. And so in that sense, you also, I think that's why you get these people go on power trips, because they just suddenly they switch from the internal feelings or good feelings to the mindset of scarcity. The external, they always need more to validate their existence and their self.
It's interesting that you say that, because I'm also a Christian as well, you know, Protestant. And so, you know, when I started getting strong in my faith, one of the things that is asked of you is to humble yourself completely. You literally have to say, I'm okay with being a slave to God. And that is tough for a human being to do. When a human being has pride, that's usually the main thing that keeps them away from being a Christian, because they're like, why do we got to do it God's way? No, I'm not going to do that. You know, I'm going to do it my way, or something like that. You know, that's the case for some people.
Yeah.
And so for me, that is something that keeps me humble, because no matter how high I can get as a person, no matter what position, no matter what status, I'm just one person out of all of them. And he's an infinite more of a higher position than I am. Yeah. So that relationship always, as long as that relationship is strong, keeps me grounded. It keeps me able to, like you said, keep inventory of who I am and what is my position, and calibrate myself to the proper level of importance and a proper level of duty and a proper level of respect for all. Because if he's saying I should respect everyone, you know, then that's something that I have to do. But
well, actually,
let me touch on what you said, Preston, because another way of, you know, I agree with you 100%. Competition is one of those things that if you're an ambitious person, you better get used to, because it's going to happen. And it doesn't mean that, you know, you're less valuable if you lose, because I like to say, well, win the next one. Win the next one. You lose this one, win the next one. There's always going to be a next one, you know, until you die.
Well, if someone's better than me, that means that there's improvements I need to make to myself and to my life.
Exactly.
You know, because the fact that they're better than me shows that there's something they're doing that I'm not, that has put them there in that position.
And even because there's people that I may never be as smart as. There's people that I'm never going to be as strong as. There's people that, you know, for me, it's like there's people that I'm never going to be as tall as. You know, that's a fact of life.
Also, just because somebody wins in a competition does not necessarily make them better than you.
But for me, what it does is, it's not about me being better than them. It's about me being the best of me.
Yeah, exactly. Be the best you.
And one of the interesting things about that is, so I have a friend named Mark, and you know, me and him raced, you know, sprints all out. We ran as fast as we could through about 100 yards. And before this, like for 6 weeks, I was running regularly, and I was sprinting regularly, and I was like, I'm gonna destroy Mark. There's no way he can even compete with me because I've been doing this, and I know how fast I am. And let me tell you something. When me and him were in the starting line, and it's only talent and effort and pure competition and what you got. Who are you?
Yeah.
There is no, you can't fake it. It's who are you in that moment. And me and him were running, and I was giving it everything I got. And he barely beat me one time. I barely beat him the next time, and then he would beat me because he had more endurance after that. And I'm telling you, the next 5 weeks of my training was like twice as much as what I had because now I had a baseline. I was like, okay, that's what I got to do. And then me and him raced again, and I was able to even up the score a little bit. I had more endurance because I was always fast. It's just for me, it was endurance. Yeah. And so it did help me become a faster person. And if I had never had that chance to compete with him, I probably would have been stuck thinking, oh, I'm really fast. I'm super fast.
Yeah, kind of on that similar note, I do think competition, especially, I love athletics, sports, and all that in general. That's all my jam. But at the same time, I do know a lot of, you have those high school superstars, and then suddenly they aren't as great in college, or they don't even go to the next level to play. Yeah. And I think when you kind of made the mentioning of like, this is who you are, this is what you got, I agree it's like the substance of your training, but at the same time, I think you have a lot of folks that tie their performance to their self-worth. And that's a very dangerous thing in any aspect, whether it's athletics or your job or whatever. Your performance does not equal your self-worth. Right. It's a very type A personality kind of thing, but it still happens nonetheless to everybody. And so I think a lot of ways, I think you have a lot of athletes that have trouble finding themselves after they're done with the sport because they've defined themselves by what they do for so long, and suddenly they don't know who they ultimately are.
Well, there's this saying I came across recently is that you will never be more than your highest aspiration. And if your highest aspiration is what you are now, you're never going to have any growth.
I don't necessarily agree with that, honestly. I think your aspirations are one thing, and those are incredibly important, but you are as worthy as you say you are. I mean, that's less an aspiration. I think, if you want to, you need to find your internal self-worth in those lot senses, and you shouldn't basically, if you want to be just be a plumber, more power to you, man. If that's what really makes you happy, if fixing pipes, or cutting hair makes you happy,
well, I think you're thinking about this in the wrong way, because I think you're saying that fixing, that being a plumber or cutting hair is somehow less than maybe some other things. That's not necessarily the point that I'm saying. I'm saying is that you can, whatever you do, you can aim for excellence within that. Okay. If you're a plumber. Okay. You don't want to be a mediocre plumber. Yeah. No, you want to be a good plumber. You want to be the plumber who people call when they have the difficult problems, who can charge more, who has a better reputation within the community. Right. That you want to be somebody who's a master of your craft, and that you're able to maximize the potential fulfillment of that career. So somebody who is constantly focused, if you're a plumber, if you're focused on being the best plumber and understanding your craft to the greatest extent, and that you're always setting that bar higher, you're keeping up to date with the new technology, you're always thinking about how you can improve. You're practicing. You're in the business regularly, so you're getting more experience. That's going to be better and yield better results than somebody like, I'm a plumber. I'm an okay plumber.
I get what you're saying. I get that. I think what he was saying is like, you don't have to be the person that wants to be the best plumber on the planet. If you're a good plumber, you know how to do the job. They can call you, and you're reliable. You're dependable. You do exactly what the boss requires of you. It's okay to say, well, I don't have to be like Jim over there who does twice as much.
You can get stuck in those cycles.
It's okay to be
Jim.
But
the problem is though is that there's always room for improvement, even if you max out in one area. Yeah. Like even if you're as good as you want to be as a plumber, like let's say you're like, you know what? I'm not the best plumber there is, but I'm good enough where I'm happy with my skill. You might be a really good plumber. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're good at other stuff. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're maybe the best father, or that you're the best leader, or that you're the best public speaker, So that there's still other things, and that what I'm talking about is that you don't want to limit yourself, essentially, because that when there's opportunity you don't want to.
I think Jordan and I it kind of comes back to what we were saying, is kind of be the best you that you can be. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And if that, be who you are ultimately, because I think while there's always room for improvement, you can also get stuck in a cycle of it's never enough, and it's almost a race to the bottom.
And that's an empty thing.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm saying. So Preston, you do it because you have an end in mind. You have a good end. Well, I want to be the best so I can serve. And other people just do it because they don't even know why they're doing it. They just know that, look, I got to compete. I got to be the best. I got to win. I need more money. And then you get the money, and I need more money.
And kind of to hit the compromise between those two, I think while your job and your profession, that's all craft, I think you yourself are a craft. Mm-hmm. And only you can work and perfect that craft. And you cannot tie those two together because that becomes two very different things.
I'm exactly the type of person you described. My whole life is putting challenge in front of me and then getting that challenge. I enjoy it. I love it. I can't get enough of it. And I want to be the best me I can be. Yeah. And like I'm harsh on myself. If I play a game, I start on hard.
Yeah.
I don't go easy. I don't do things easy. Yeah. If I get good enough at it, I want 3 players against me.
Yeah.
I love that because it makes you rise to the challenge. But that's a feature of my personality.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people out there that they just don't have that feature. There's a lot of people out there that they just want to play the game because it's enjoyable, because it's fun, and they want to put it on easy so that they can dominate or something like that. And that's fine. But I am the type of person you're describing, Preston. I'm just saying that's not. You don't have to do that. That you don't have to push yourself in that direction. If you're good enough at things, why do you?
But there's something to clarify though. That the thing is, because we're talking about humility, we need to make a distinction between being arrogant versus being happy. Mm-hmm. Because what I was addressing was the arrogant side. Mm-hmm. I'm not necessarily saying that everybody needs to be like, I'm going to be the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, or I'm going to be the president of the United States. That's never the point I made. What I'm talking about is from the perspective of arrogance. That, if you're content with what you have, that's not arrogance, it's gratitude. And there's nothing wrong. Gratitude is a virtue too. I think it's important that we have gratitude and that we're thankful for what we have, and that if we've attained a certain level of ability in something, that we appreciate that. The main point in bringing this up, with that quote that, you're never going to be more than your highest aspiration, is because what happens is that you might have the potential to be more, and you might want to be more. You might have had higher goals in the beginning, but when you become arrogant, whether you're happy or not, you limit yourself just to what that is. And having that humility is important, not only to reaching your goal, but also being able to define what that is. That if I've reached a limit in what I'm achieving because I'm happy, that's fine, and I can live with that, and I can be grateful. Whereas if I have reached a limit in what I'm capable of, just because I think, I'm the shit, and no one's better than me, and I know everything, that's different. And at in the former case, that might be a valid reason not to pursue more power or wealth or fame or any of these other things that people go after. But in the latter case, it's absolutely not. It's like, no, that's more of just an excuse or short-sightedness on my part. And that what happens is when we're thinking about what do we want to achieve, we have to think about it am I achieving this just because it's going to make me happy? Am I achieving this because it's going to make me happy? Or am I achieving this just because it's going to make me feel good and I'll have bragging rights over people? And the interesting thing about that is it works both ways. Not only can it push us to achieve more in some cases, recognizing that we could be more than what we might feel is necessary to stack up well against our peers, but also sometimes could take us down a notch. That if we're focused more on what makes us happy, as opposed to what will just give us bragging rights. Let's say you are an ultra ambitious person, and you are willing to go after some of those highest positions. If you look at it from a perspective of humility, that might be what it takes to make you realize maybe you don't need to be the CEO to be happy.
Okay, so what was that quote again? Say it again.
It's that you will never be more than your highest aspiration.
Yeah.
And what I had said, my follow-up to that would be, if your highest aspiration is what you are now, you're never going to be more than that.
Yeah, and so that strikes me, because now let me defend your point, is, there are people out there, and there's probably people who are watching this. Like, there's people that I come into contact with all the time, and they're so talented, they're so brilliant, and they're good at, they're very task-oriented, they're conscientious people, their psychology is very healthy, they're just dynamic people that could accomplish so much, but they don't want to. They just simply don't want to. They don't have the aspirations. And I was like, dude, if you just wanted to, if you just had the aspiration, you could accomplish twice as much as you probably want to. And I don't know, it's not my position to impose on them, like say, hey, you need to be accomplishing twice as much. It would just be nice for them to know, to see what I see in them, to see that potential that might go unrealized. Because to me, it's like having a phone and you're using half of the features. That's one of the things that bugs me, man, is when people don't use things.
I know.
Right? When it's like you got a Ferrari in the driveway and you're one of those people that just never get a chance to drive it. And that thing goes day by day and you're not doing it. So that's a personal thing. I'm not, I'm not imposing that on anybody. That's just an observation that I make.
In the sense of competition too, one of my favorite quotes is, hard work always beats talent when talent doesn't work hard.
Yep.
In a lot of cases, I mean, there's two perspectives on that, because I can also see like a talented person who like maybe they're a brilliant person, but ultimately they find their passion. I love teaching like high school, even though they could probably be like an award-winning professor at some university. Like this is what I love doing, And if they, there's two sides to that, because if they realize their potential and they say, I choose to do this because it makes me happiest. And I'm not going to let somebody else tell me like how to live my life to make me happiest, even if they think I would be so much better. If I know deep down that this is what I want to do, then I think that is absolutely within their right. More power to them. But at the same time, there's also that frustrating part of somebody who like you have so much potential, but you just fail to realize it.
And so to tie this back into humility, there's an observation that I made. It's like a eureka moment that I had. And this is, I'm going to put this out there for anybody, put in your back pocket. So this is the truth about humility and pride, okay? So excessive pride feels good. Let's just be honest out there.
Yeah.
You feel that sense, like it's like right after you've accomplished something and you feel this sense of, you're great.
Yeah.
That's why people name themselves Alexander the Great. It feels good, but only to you. Whereas humility brings pleasure to everyone else.
Yeah.
When you're around someone who is great, but they're constantly lowering themselves, in an eloquent way, not in a I suck, I'm stupid, but in a way that they try to equalize themselves to other people, even though they're talented, or like it's like if a billionaire comes to me and he's able to be humble with me, it's so attractive, it's so. It makes you love that person. It really it's good feelings all around.
There's a difference.
So let me sort of encapsulate that. So excessive pride, something that feels good to you. When you have that humility, that's going to make everyone else feel good. And that's just one of those things.
So what I was going to say, and I think this ties a little bit into courage, because I know that's the next thing we're going to get into, where there's a difference between pride and confidence, and that humility actually goes hand in hand with confidence, because the thing is, people who name themselves like the great are always bragging about what they've done. In some cases, it's almost like, in the sad part about this, a lot of times people who've achieved enough to be worthy of that title don't need to compensate for anything, but it's almost, it gives the impression like you're compensating for something. That, in my mind, somebody who's truly great, their actions speak for them.
You don't need to tell people.
You don't need to go around telling people, oh, look how smart I am, look how great I am. No. People will know when they talk to you. People will know when you walk into the room. And what it is that when you're humble, there's a certain level of confidence that comes with that, in the sense that it's like, what? I know my value. I know the value of other people, and that what I have to say is worth it, and that my leadership is just and it's good and it's reasonable, and that I know it to a sufficient degree of certainty where I don't need to be constantly lifting myself up above other people and telling people how good I am for that to be true. And a lot of times, the best leaders, like, Miyamoto Musashi was one who had kind of followed this. He's the guy who wrote the Book of Five Rings. Like, if you read the story of his life, or maybe a more famous example, one especially, Jordan, since you and I are both Christians, and even people who are not Christians generally understand Christianity, is like Jesus, how Jesus, is the highest being there is. He's God in the flesh, and yet he was able to humble himself, because what it was that Jesus, recognizing that he's the most powerful being in the universe, doesn't have anything to prove. He's already on top of everything, and like, why does somebody who is truly that great, why does somebody who's truly that great need to be constantly reminding people of how good they are?
Yeah, one thing I always tell myself, and it's from One of my favorite shows, Neon Genesis Evangelion. It's a great show if you guys have not seen it. But at the very end, one of the quotes the main character says is he comes to realization. He says, "I am no more or less than myself." He says, "I am me." And I try to repeat that to myself as often as I can because it's confidence, but it's also humbling at the same time. You are just you.
Yeah.
Don't overdo it, but also don't waste what you know you can be. In a lot of ways.
It gives you a sense of peace, man.
Yeah.
Like that's what I love about humility.
Stop trying to be somebody you're not. Just be yourself.
So the reason why I wanted to throw in courage after that is because, and I think we did a good job of accomplishing this, is because, Wisdom Factory is for our audience is ambitious people. Yeah, the people who want to learn just to learn for the sake of learning, that's fine. But it's really for people who want to challenge themselves.
We want to unite knowledge with action.
So, they unite knowledge with action and maximize your potential. Because, for injustice to rule the world, a good man just needs to do nothing. And I truly believe that. And so that's why there is a level of responsibility for someone who has great potential to use that potential. So if you have too much humility and you lower yourself too much, if you don't understand what humility is and you're just like, well, I'm trying to be humble, so I'm not going to pursue something, that's a dangerous thing. So with all virtues, there's a balance. And so that's why I wanted to bring in courage right after humility, is because, don't ever stop yourself from accomplishing what you want to accomplish. You should be humble while you're doing it, but don't let even humility stop. Don't become an asshole. But being humble doesn't mean having a humble occupation. You can still be the king or president or whatever or CEO and be humble.
Or being humble doesn't mean you have to roll over to anybody who wants to get their way.
Exactly. It has nothing to do with what you're doing in your life. It just has to do with how you're doing it.
Yeah.
And so that's the next thing I wanted to talk about. So let's talk about courage, because for me, the main thing and this is courage, but biggest aspect of courage is decisiveness. That's kind of what I wanted to focus on here, is because, a lot of times we get in our own way. We get in our own way because we don't want to be decisive in a certain situation, usually it's because other people are telling you can't do it. A lot of times you get that. People are like, why do you can't do that? What do you mean? Like, you just don't have it. Why don't you just wait? Other people seep in and sort of affect your confidence that you can accomplish something. Or it's just simply you're just someone who is not very good at being decisive. And a lot of times it's because of fear of a consequence. So I think courage and decisiveness go hand in hand.
Yeah.
And when we talk about the Wisdom Factory, we're about success. We're about, action. And that's why decisiveness in this situation is important and should be talked about. So what do you guys feel like in terms of your courage? Do you guys feel like you have good courage in the majority of things in your life? Or are there times when you feel like, I just wish I wasn't as scared as I am?
I mean, I guess
It's a personal question.
I could take this first. I'll never paint myself as a bastion of courage. There have definitely been times where I could have spoken up and said something that I felt was wrong, about something, but I just passed on it. Whether it was just because I didn't have time, or I'd rather, not rock the boat in some cases. I mean, there's a lot to be said about courage. I mean, for me, whenever I think of courage, and it kind of actually popped in my head, we were talking about biased juries and judges and stuff, was Atticus Finch. Because he, in To Kill a Mockingbird, he has a lot of good stuff to say about, courage in a lot of cases is, I gotta see if I remember this right. Basically, he says, when you know you're licked, when you know you're beat, but you choose to fight on anyway, when all the odds say this is not going to happen, and you still choose to say that, no, I'm going to go forward with what I believe is right, regardless of what other people are going to say. And I think that has a lot to do with your courage and ambition. But ultimately, I mean, from a personal level too, when it comes to that confidence aspect you talked about, for a long time, especially my teenage years, I was a very self-deprecating person. And it comes across in humor all the time, but there were genuinely times where I would rag on myself so hard, and eventually kind of come to the realization that there's a lot of folks in the world, but majority of the world's going to say you can't do it. Right. And the last thing you need is another person in yourself saying that you can't do it.
Yeah.
You got to be on your own team. Yeah. You always have to be on your own team. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for me, and I think most people fall somewhere in this range. For the extremes are kind of rare, but I would say it's kind of in between. Like, I think that I have been a pretty courageous person for the most part, but I definitely feel that there are some areas in my life where I could have some improvement with that. And that maybe I haven't been as courageous as I could be. So I'm kind of going to give a little bit of explanation with both. So, the reason why I say I'm courageous overall is for a couple of reasons. First of all, because I'm not afraid to go up against difficult odds. My life has been one that's filled with difficult odds. I did poorly in school when I was a young kid, like in elementary, middle, even high school. That I didn't have the best grades. And then also my father had passed away when I was relatively young, and there's a lot of obstacles in my life, and it would have been easy for me to sort of shy away from those, but I've had the courage to power through it and say, and set my sights high and say, you know what, I'm going, to go to college. And I've gotten better at that because, my goals are a lot higher. Like, challenge was something that when I was a little kid, I did sort of shy away from. Whereas right now, like, I'm in so many different organizations. Like, I'm in SOC and I work really hard with my classes, a lot harder than I used to, and I have good grades now, whereas in the past I didn't, and I'm president of the Wisdom Factory, and like all these different things, and that I've learned to welcome challenge. The reason why I say my courage isn't perfect, though, and honestly, I don't think anybody's courage is perfect, but I guess maybe why my courage isn't as good as it could be, or is where I would want it to be, is because I still feel like sometimes I have a certain comfort zone that I don't want to get out of. Now, given I have chosen to get out of it anyway in a lot of instances, which is why I still say that I have courage. But it can be difficult sometimes, to leave that, like, with certain circumstances. And then the other thing too is, and this is something I guess that is probably the biggest reason why I would say I still want to develop more courage, is I do get analysis paralysis sometimes, because the thing is that when we think about things, because knowledge is good, and that I'm somebody who believes that, so I think about things that I do. But one of the costs that can come with that is that when you think about things, it's inevitable that at some point the consequences of your actions are going to enter your mind. And success is something that requires risk. Success, the people who have done good things in their life, who have achieved a lot of times are people who are willing to go out and say, you know what, I don't care if it's 100-to-1 odds, I'm going to do it anyway. And that what can happen is sometimes you can overthink, in the sense that when you understand the consequences of your actions, it can get you to sort of be paralyzed. Whereas if you're Evel Knievel and you don't give a crap about the consequences of your actions, then it's easier to be decisive. Now, I'm not necessarily advocating that you be, like Evel Knievel. Like, I think that's an extreme. Like, we definitely want to, to guard certain things like our life and our chances of a better future. We don't want to make bad decisions, but at the same time, a little bit of risk is necessary, and sometimes it is good to do something that you might fail at. Sometimes, if the payoff is high enough, it is good to do something that you will probably fail at, and that's something that I struggle with sometimes. That when I have instances where, I'm thinking about the consequences, and I've kind of come to a conclusion about, okay, this is probably what's going to happen. If I don't feel like it's in my favor, or if I feel like that there's a bunch of different options and I'm having a hard time deciding between the two or three, or however many there may be, it can be difficult to commit. And that is something where I've gotten a lot better at, especially being in student government and stuff, where you have to pick a path, you have to pick a side. But as with everything I do, I'm not aiming for average or above average or good enough. I'm aiming for excellence. I'm aiming to be the most courageous person I can. And I'd say that's one of the areas where I think I could stand to improve some of my courage a little bit.
Yeah, so mine is, and this is a huge problem. Like, I don't know why I do this. But so with me, it's about with people who I put them on a pedestal because they either have great accomplishments, or they have good, high status or high rank. They have they're like a professor or something, or they're like a businessman, or they're an elected official, or they're a student that just has a lot of accolades that I don't have. A lot of times I find myself paralyzed by fear to go up to them and be myself with them. I become a lesser version of me, because I feel intimidated by them and what they've accomplished, and I should. right? We talked about humility, like we talked about, everyone is equal with justice, and it shouldn't be that way. Like, it doesn't matter who you are. If President Obama came here and sat down, I know I should not be intimidated by him. I should show him the respect. I should congratulate him on his accomplishments, but that shouldn't allow me to keep my mouth shut and just defer to him. I should be able to have the courage to be just as I am with everyone else with that person. And people that do that demonstrate their worth a lot more than just because it's being shy. It's being shy. And I'm not shy around regular people. I'm really not. I'm happy-go-lucky. But that does seem to happen to me when I get into higher status circles, and I do feel that fear. But one thing about fear is, it's like Batman. Remember that scene in Batman where he was a scared guy in the beginning, and then he realized that he had to confront his fear, and he goes down into the well, and there's that scene where all those bats are surrounding him, and they do a close-up on his face, and you can see him battling with that fear, and then he begins to accept it, and he begins to embrace it. And so sometimes I do confront fear, and it's exhilarating when you do that. So sometimes I'm able to rise to the challenge. I just wish I was always able to rise to the challenge, because almost every single time when I demonstrate courage and I overcome fear, a positive consequence happens. And that's why I think this virtue is so important, because courage can really, what it does most, it just opens up so many opportunities for you.
Yeah, and the thing with courage too is that it's about being able to act in a way that you're decisive, but that you also stay focused on justice. Because I feel like confronting fear just for the sake of confronting fear and not doing anything else that can be sort of a vice in and of itself. Like, that can be foolhardiness, like with the Evel Knievel example that I gave earlier, there's a certain point where it's not courage, where, you're just doing things because you want to show how much of a man you are or something like that. And that's not good. That I don't believe that we should be putting ourselves in unnecessarily dangerous or unnecessarily uncomfortable situations. That we do want to be careful, what kind of risks we take, and that, if there's, even when it comes to our comfort zone, if there's no good reason to leave that, maybe we should stay there. But at the same time, there often is a good reason to leave that comfort zone, and that when you see that there's good that could come out of it, like you think about, a father raising his kids, or a soldier defending his country. Like, those are things where not only is there a risk, but in addition to that, overcoming that risk carries with it something that is in alignment with the value of justice. So there is a moral good that comes as a result of that action, and a moral harm that comes as a result of shying away out of fear. So I think that fear can play an important role sometimes, because it gives us a good idea of what sort of decisions we should and should not make. When I have fear of a circumstance, that's my instincts telling me that this is something that may carry certain dangers with it, and that there's a probability that something bad could happen if I'm able to go with that. That being said, fear needs to be something that we use in alignment with justice and alignment with rationality, and that if we determine that shying away from that fear is going to be something that perpetuates injustice in the world, or if we feel that shying away from that fear, is something that is not bringing any kind of good. We're just doing it because it makes us feel comfortable, as opposed to because there's actually something there. Like, if the fear is not rational, like what phobias, for example, that then we might want to, to go ahead and confront that, because the long-term payoff is going to outweigh, that discomfort and that challenge that we get by confronting that issue.
Yeah, and fear paralyzes, and that's why, because fear is the opposite of courage, and that's where I get decisiveness from, is because when someone is scared, they don't want to do anything, because they're afraid of all the risks and all the consequences. Whereas someone who has courage, there are times when you're going to have incomplete information, and you still have to do something. A good example of this was the worst presidents that we rank in the United States. It's not because they were incompetent per se, it's because they were indecisive in a time of crisis. Things were going to hell around them, and they did nothing. A good example of that is I think his name is Harrison. The president right before Abraham Lincoln just sat there and watched as the southern states were like, okay, we're gonna secede. Okay, we're gonna mobilize troops. Okay, we're gonna threaten you guys, and this guy did nothing. And he is known as like the 49th best president, or like the number 1 or 2 worst president, simply because of indecisiveness.
Yeah.
And that created chaos, in his country.
Because at the end of the day, something that's imperfect that gets something done is forgivable if the circumstances, like you said, there's incomplete knowledge. People are going to understand that. Whereas when nothing, a lot of times doing nothing is like the worst thing that you can do. That even an imperfect response is going to be something that's better than just allowing the problem to continue existing.
Yeah, and you counter that with someone who had tremendous courage, like a Theodore Roosevelt, who took on, the rich and the wealthy and all the powerful people. I mean, getting threats constantly. This is gonna not end well for you and your livelihood, and constant threats of assassination. When you take on the establishment, when you take on the really super powerful, the really super unjust people, they don't have no qualms about getting rid of you or making your life suffer. They don't care.
It was kind of like with the Clinton body count, people getting suicided.
He still had the courage to do that because he knew this is the right thing to do. This needs to be done. And you know what? I'm going to do it. And at the end of the day, shoot, man, courage is the closest virtue that you can have to being a superhero.
Yeah.
All superheroes have courage because you're facing Thanos.
Yeah.
And you still got to figure out a way to take him down.
I think courage ties in really nicely with also humility, because courage, it's a lot easier to be brave when you absolutely know you're right. Or at least to the best of your ability, that what I'm doing is right. And the best way to know without doubt what you're doing is right is to be in touch with other people and to be in touch with yourself and to know what you believe and what you value. And that ability I think that helps be decisive, because when you're sure of who you are and what you believe to be right, it's easier to take a stand for it, versus if you're just going to be wishy-washy about it because you're not even sure who you are or what you believe, then suddenly it's a lot harder to take a stand. But if you have rock-solid foundation both in yourself and in your beliefs, then you can stand for it, usually against as much ridicule or threats as it takes.
Yeah, there's this video on YouTube about Martin Luther King, and when he he said that he talked to God or something like that, or God reached out to him, or he felt a sense of something, is when he got a phone call, right? And the dirtiest phone call. He said it was the most ugliest voice you could possibly imagine, threatening him, saying, we're going to blow up your house. You just all you have to do is stop doing what you're doing. And it broke him. He said, he cried, and he sort of got under his table, and or like he got on the ground, and he just sort of was questioning, why is he doing everything? And that was fear overwhelming him. I'm going to lose my livelihood. Just is it worth it?
Might lose his life.
And he said, at the bottom, he cried out to God, and he said that God gave him the message, and he said, you stand up for righteousness. Very powerful voice. And he said he stood up and he never questioned it. After that, he's like, this is what I'm going to do no matter what the consequences are. The consequences ended up being what this guy said was going to happen.
Yeah.
But like I said, he's a heroic man for doing heroic deeds in that situation. And, that's almost as close to perfect courage as you can get.
And kind of building on what you were saying about it going hand in hand with humility, it's like one thing we have to contend with sometimes is the potential that we might not live to see the full fruition of what we're doing, or that it might not just be about us. We might not get all the credit, even if we do live to see it. That, being able to concede that, maybe you're part of something. This is not just you. You're part of something that's bigger than you. You're part of something that is going to have impacts on a level beyond just your immediate surroundings in your personal life, and being able to acknowledge that and be willing to accept that and say, you know what, that I'm just part of this, but I'm willing to be that part and to do what I can, is a really powerful thing. And it goes hand in hand with courage, because sometimes with courage, when you're thinking about whether something is worth it, we have a tendency to think of it just from a self-interested perspective. We have a tendency to think about it as like, oh, well, either I get what I want or I don't. If I'm sacrificing my livelihood potentially, like if you're risking that, is it worth it? A lot of people will answer that question by, well, what's in it for me? And that's not how you want to go about it. You have to think about, what am I contributing to? What are going to be the outcomes? And even if I don't finish it by myself, or even if somebody else gets the credit for portions of it, that is this still something that's worth pursuing?
So to wrap this up, guys, let's say there's someone out there watching that doesn't have the courage that they'd like to have. They're struggling. They're not handling situations that they know they could handle. They just had a little bit more fortitude. What would you say to this person? How could they sort of develop or improve their character in this aspect and become more courageous and strong?
I'll go for that one. Yeah, so really the best way that I would say is that when it comes to failure, when it comes to some of the fears that you have, it's not as bad as you think. That what I have encountered looking back at like high school and middle school and even early college, certain things that I thought were a big deal back then, certain times where I didn't do something that would have been good for me to do because I was afraid of, I might be humiliated in front of my friends. A lot of that doesn't matter several years from now, given in some extreme circumstances it can, especially like with politics, but at the end of the day, I think when something's immediate, sometimes we have a tendency to overstate the impact that that's going to have, and that failure is something that should be used as a learning experience rather than just something that should be feared. I don't think necessarily that failure should be sought out. I think at the end of the day, success always is preferable to failure, but it's not realistic to expect that you're never going to fail, that you have to expose yourself to that potential of failure in order to have the opportunity of success, and just know that even if something happens, even if your fear or whatever it is that's preventing you comes true, it'll be difficult, but that's not going to be the last thing. It's not going to finish you. There'll be other opportunities you can get back up, and that actually might make you stronger because you can learn from that and you can deconstruct that failure, see how it happened and why it happened, and you can be better the next time. So, really, go for it. Follow your dreams and make sure that you're thinking about things on the proper scale. Don't limit your analysis just to the short-term consequences in the here and now. Think about how it's going to impact the course of your life and whether or not it's going to help you leave the mark on this world that you want to leave. And leaving that mark is not always going to be easy. A lot of times it's going to be very difficult, and that's why we need courage. That way we can move forward anyway, even in those situations where we may have to make tough decisions or get outside of our consequences to achieve what we seek to accomplish.
Yeah, I think I agree with you on that. I think the first step to finding your courage and finding your strength is to find yourself in a lot of ways. You need to really understand who you are, what you value, what you believe, and don't be sorry for it. Even if it's somebody who people don't think you are, you need to be yourself. I think that's going to be the easiest way to be brave, is when you are sure of yourself and your actions. Going beyond that, this might sound a little bit morbid, but honestly, I would rather live 10 years being authentically and unapologetically myself than live 100 pretending to be somebody else. I would really, and so I encourage you to, because we only have one life, and it's a bit cliche, but we really do only have one life, and it is up to you how you spend it and how you live it, ultimately, and you need to be the best you that you can be, and you need to be unapologetically yourself, because this is the one chance you really have to do it. And so in that sense, you really do need to find who you are and define who you are, and not be sorry for it by any means, and stand for what you believe in and be unapologetic about it.
Yeah, so I would say I have two things to say. One of them is just more of an elaboration of what you said about finding yourself. But the first one was like a hack, because you can find quick courage if you put on the right song, just get in the right mood. Because everyone has that courage button. Just press it. Find a way to turn that on. Get in the right mindset. For me, sometimes I do push-ups and boom, there I am. I'm ready to go. So whether it's a song, watching a video on YouTube, you can get access to quick courage, but that's not the deep courage that I think someone needs in their life, because sometimes that's just inaccessible. You can't do those things. So for the deep courage, what I do and what works best for me in most situations when I do it is when I think back on my life, like in depth. I go through all my memories. I go through everything I've been through, all the challenges that I've faced, the ones that I've lost, the ones that I've won. And I remind myself of the constancy of who I am and what it is that I'm fighting for and what it is that I'm trying to achieve. And I just really get deep within myself, and like you said, and see who I am. And I realize that I am fighting for something worthy, and that I can't. It's almost becomes not an option to be scared. So you have to do this if you really want what you've been fighting for your whole life. You have to do it. And when you go through that, it's like a montage, right?
Yeah.
It's like a montage of your life. You just the moment becomes almost smaller than who you are, you know. At least for me, and that's something that's quite powerful when I go through my life and all the ups and downs and what it really means to be in this moment, to actually be thankful that I have an opportunity to move further.
Yeah, like I've been through that too, like that ability to zoom out almost, you know, to zoom out, because I had mentioned, you know, what I was saying about how sometimes we get limited to just understanding things based on the here and now, and that when you have something in your mind in terms of what you want to be, what you want to accomplish, being able to have something to go back to and focus on is extremely valuable, and being able to constantly remind yourself and understanding situations not just in and of themselves, but in the context of everything else that you are and everything else that you want to be and want to do. And it helps you give an assessment that's more grounded, you know, because you have to keep things in perspective. You have to understand not only the absolute nature of things, but also where those things lie in relation to other variables in your life.
Well, Cleveland, I apologize for keeping you for 2 hours.
Hey, no, this has been a
35
blast.
minutes,
This has been a
but,
blast.
I think that was a perfect point to end this, and it's been an amazing podcast. This is fun when we get to do this, you know, and talk about these things, philosophize about these things. We didn't just spit out all kinds of information that we read. There was a lot of thinking here, a lot of philosophizing. I appreciate you guys for sharing all that you did. And I appreciate you for being here. So again, tell people where they can find you. For
I host the
content.
Sam Mo Show. We are available on YouTube, Google Podcast, Spotify, and Apple Podcast. We are also available on Twitter at Sam Mo Show. Feel free to reach out to us. We have a different guest on every week. Be sure to tune in. New episodes are every Friday around noon, if I can get it uploaded in that amount of time. More importantly, you know, I think you can gain a lot from it. It's I can't guarantee it's going to be as highbrow as this, because this is some pretty high-level thinking, but I think you could enjoy it just as much if you like this kind of content. So just be sure to check us out. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, and YouTube.
All right. Well, let's,
Thank you guys so much for having me, by the way.
Thank you. So let's end out on saying the three things that we covered today. Justice.
Courage.
Humility.
There we go.
Not the right order, but hey. Awesome.
That was good.
Yeah, that was really good. Time flew by, man. Wow.
Yes.
Yeah, no, dude, I had looked at my watch earlier on.
Whoa.
It's like at the 1 hour mark, I was like, oh my God.